Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Story 1. We set out early that morning, the air thick with humidity, as the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon. The sawgrass was eerily still and quiet as we puttered down the narrow canals. I remember thinking it felt almost too quiet, like the whole swamp was holding its breath. We found a good spot where the canal widened out a bit, and Bones cut the engine. The silence was deafening after the drone of the motor. As we drifted, I could hear every little splash and rustle in the reeds around us. My senses felt hyper-alert, like my body knew something was off, even if my mind hadn't caught up yet. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour, not having much luck, when I noticed some movement in the water about 30 yards away. At first I thought it was just a big gator, but as I squinted to get a better look, I realized it was way too big to be a gator. The thing was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet long. Its skin was a deep reddish-black color, almost like dried blood. It seemed to be wading in the shallows, using its long arms to scoop up vegetation and crabs. I nudged Bones and pointed silently. His eyes went wide as he saw it too. We sat there frozen, barely breathing, watching this creature move through the water. It didn't seem to notice us at first, but then, in a movement so fast I could hardly track it, the thing whipped its entire body around to face us. The way it moved was all wrong, fluid and boneless in a way no animal should be able to move. For a split second, I locked eyes with it. They were jet black and completely expressionless, but I swear I could feel the intelligence behind them. A primal fear gripped me, every instinct screaming that we needed to get the hell out of there. I must have made some small sound of terror because Bones snapped out of his paralysis and started the motor. The creature's head snapped towards the noise, and I saw its mouth open in what looked like a silent roar, revealing rows of wicked, sharp teeth. Bones gunned the engine, and we took off down the canal as fast as the little boat could go. I kept my eyes locked on the thing until we rounded a bend and lost sight of it. Part of me expected to see it charging after us through the water, but there was nothing. We didn't say a word the whole way back to the boat ramp. I think we were both in shock, trying to process what we'd just seen. It wasn't until we were loading up the truck that Bones finally broke the silence. "What the fuck was that thing?" he whispered, his voice shaky. I just shook my head. I had no answers. Nothing in my experience could explain what we'd encountered out there. We agreed not to tell anyone about it. Who would believe us anyway? But we couldn't just let it go either. A week later, when my cast came off, we decided to go back out there. We told ourselves we were just going fishing again, but we both knew the real reason. This time, we went deeper into the swamp, following the twisting canals further than we'd ever gone before. The air felt heavy and oppressive, like the whole place was alive and watching us. Every snapping twig or splash in the water had us on edge. As the day wore on and we saw no sign of the creature, I started to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had just been a weirdly shaped log and our minds had played tricks on us. But then, as dusk started to fall, we heard it. It was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed off the water in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the humid air. Then the smell hit us. It was like nothing I've ever experienced before or since. A mixture of rotting vegetation, stagnant water, and something musky and animal. It was so strong I could practically taste it. Bones and I looked at each other, both of us pale and wide-eyed. Without a word, he started the motor, and we hightailed it out of there. The growling seemed to follow us all the way back to the main canal. We never went back to that part of the sawgrass after that. Hell, I didn't go fishing at all for months afterwards. The memory of that creature and those inhuman sounds haunted my dreams. To this day, I can't explain what we saw out there. I've done research, looked into local legends and cryptid sightings, but nothing quite matches up with our experience. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a shared hallucination or something, but deep down, I know what we saw was real. I still live in Florida, but I steer clear of the swamps now. Whenever I drive past the sawgrass, I can't help but wonder if that thing is still out there, lurking in the murky waters. And sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that bone-chilling growl echoing in the distance. Story 2. I still remember that day in Stewart State Forest like it was yesterday. It was October 1999, during deer hunting season. My brother Jake had just come back from his military deployment, so we decided to go on a hunting trip together like we used to when we were younger. We arrived at our usual spot, deep in the forest, before dawn. As the sky began to lighten, we split up to cover more ground. I found a good vantage point overlooking a small clearing and settled in to wait. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as I scanned the tree line, rifle at the ready. After a couple uneventful hours, I noticed some movement in the brush about 100 yards away. My heart quickened. Finally, some action. I raised my scope, expecting to see a deer emerge. But what stepped out from behind the trees was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first glance, it looked like a large brown bear moving on all fours. But something about its movement seemed off. It was too fluid, almost graceful in a way that didn't match a bear's lumbering gait. As I watched, frozen, the creature slowly rose up on 2 legs. My brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It stood at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur. But it wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its legs were long and muscular like a man's. The head was what really got me, though. It sat directly on broad shoulders without much of a neck, and the face, it was flat and wide, almost human-like, but with a heavy brow ridge and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But when I looked again, it was still there. Moving with eerie silence for something so large, it began walking on 2 legs toward the clearing. Its gait was smooth but slightly rolling, almost like a person who's not quite steady on their feet. My hands shook as I tried to keep my rifle trained on it. I had a clear shot, but found myself unable to pull the trigger. Some primal instinct told me this was no ordinary animal. As it entered the clearing, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. There were several deer grazing nearby, but they showed no signs of alarm. Deer are incredibly skittish creatures. They should have bolted at the first sight or smell of a large predator, but they just kept calmly eating as if nothing was amiss. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, its head swiveling slowly as it surveyed the area. For a heart-stopping moment, I swear its gaze locked onto my position. I felt pinned in place, barely daring to breathe. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the forest. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than a couple minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I sat there for a long time afterwards, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wondered if I had dozed off and dreamed the whole thing, but I knew deep down it had been real. When Jake found me a couple hours later, I was still in the same spot, my rifle unfired. He could tell something was wrong and kept pressing me about what had happened. I tried to explain, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. Jake listened patiently, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Maybe it was just a bear," he suggested gently. "The light can play tricks on you out here." I wanted to believe him. It would have been easier to write it off as a bear or some other known animal. But I knew what I saw. The way it moved, the strange silence, the deer's lack of reaction. None of it added up to anything normal. We cut our trip short and headed home that afternoon. I was too shaken to focus on hunting anyway. On the drive back, I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind, analyzing every detail. The image of that creature haunted my dreams for weeks afterwards. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those dark eyes boring into me. I became obsessed with researching similar sightings in the area, spending hours online and at the library. To my surprise, I found quite a few reports of strange, ape-like creatures in the forests of New York State. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but some accounts were from respected outdoorsmen and law enforcement officials, people who knew the woods and weren't prone to flights of fancy. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I'd seen that day was what some call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I know how that sounds. Before that day, I would have laughed at anyone claiming to have seen such a creature. Now, I'm not so sure. I've gone back to Stewart State Forest many times since then, hoping to catch another glimpse or find some kind of evidence. But I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the feeling of those eyes on me, and I know it was real. I haven't told many people about what happened. Most would think I was crazy or making it up. Jake humors me, but I can tell he doesn't really believe it. My wife listens patiently when I need to talk about it, but I know she worries about my obsession with the incident. It's been over 20 years now, but that day is still vivid in my mind. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it was just a bear or some other explainable animal, but deep down, I know what I saw. There's something out there in those woods that defies conventional explanation. I still go hunting every season, but it's different now. I'm always on edge, scanning the trees for any sign of that creature. Part of me hopes to see it again, to prove to myself and others that I'm not crazy. But another part dreads the possibility of another encounter. What would I do if I saw it again? Would I have the presence of mind to try to document it somehow, or would I freeze up like last time? I've played out countless scenarios in my head over the years. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I used to see the forest as a peaceful place, somewhere to connect with nature. Now there's always an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that I'm being watched. I've become more attuned to the subtle sounds and movements of the woods. Every snapped twig or rustling leaf sets my heart racing. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that towering figure emerge from the shadows. Sometimes I wish I could just forget that day ever happened. Go back to my simple life of hunting trips and not questioning the world around me. But once you've seen something like that, there's no unseeing it. It opens your eyes to possibilities you never considered before. I've tried to find logical explanations for what I saw. Could it have been a person in a suit? But the movements were too natural, too fluid for a costume. A bear standing on its hind legs. But the proportions were all wrong, and bears don't walk bipedally for extended periods. In the end, I'm left with more questions than answers. What was that creature? Are there more like it out there? How have they managed to stay hidden for so long? The not knowing is what really gets to me. I still go about my daily life, work, family, hobbies. But that encounter is always there in the back of my mind. It's changed how I see the world, made me question what I thought I knew about nature and reality itself. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself, but I know what I saw that day in Stewart State Forest, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 3. I was driving down a rural road near Palmyra late one autumn evening in 1989. The sun had just set, and that eerie twilight was settling in. You know how everything looks kind of hazy and unfocused at that time? Well, I was cruising along, not really thinking about much, when I saw what I thought was a deer up ahead on the shoulder. I slowed down, of course. The last thing I wanted was to hit a deer and total my car. As I got closer, I realized something was off. The shape wasn't quite right for a deer. It was too bulky. The proportions were weird. I figured maybe it was a bear, but we don't get many of those around here. I was probably about 50 yards away when this thing suddenly stood up on two legs. I'm not ashamed to admit I nearly pissed myself. It was huge, had to be at least 7 feet tall, and it was covered in this shaggy brown fur. For a split second, our eyes met. I swear to God, it looked right at me. Then it turned and bolted into the woods. I sat there in my idling car for a good 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I kept telling myself it had to be a guy in a costume or something, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way it moved, it was too fluid, too natural. No costume could mimic that. I didn't tell anyone about it for years. Who would believe me? Hell, I barely believed it myself. But that night changed me. I became hyper-aware every time I drove down that road, always scanning the tree line, half hoping, half dreading I'd see it again. Fast forward to 2011. I'd mostly pushed that memory to the back of my mind, convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. I was driving home from a late shift at work. It was probably around 1 a.m. The road was deserted, and I was fighting to stay awake. As I approached the old bridge that crosses over Passenger Creek, I saw something that made me slam on my brakes. There, in the middle of the bridge, was a massive black figure. It was just standing there, motionless. At first, I thought maybe it was a broken-down car or something, but as my headlights illuminated it, I realized it was alive. This thing was easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was built like a linebacker, broad shoulders, thick arms, and legs like tree trunks. But the weirdest part was its head. It was almost cone-shaped, coming to a point at the top. I sat there frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it started to move. It didn't turn to look at me or anything. It just started walking across the bridge with these long, purposeful strides. Its arms swung in this exaggerated way, almost like it was doing some kind of weird power walk. As it reached the other side of the bridge, it disappeared into the tree line. I waited a good 10 minutes before I worked up the courage to drive across that bridge. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheels straight. When I got home, I immediately started researching. I found out that there had been other sightings in the area. People reported hearing strange noises in the woods, not quite animal, not quite human. Some folks even claimed they'd found weird marks on their property, like something huge had been walking around. I reached out to a local paranormal investigation group. They were interested in my story and asked if they could interview me. I agreed, figuring it might help me make sense of what I'd seen. The investigator, a guy named Mike, met me at a local diner. He listened to my story without interrupting, just nodding and taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his seat and sighed. "You're not the first person to see something like this around here," he said. "We've been getting reports for years. Most people are too scared to come forward, afraid people will think they're crazy." He showed me some photos on his phone. They were grainy and dark, but I could make out a large humanoid shape in a few of them. My blood ran cold. It was like looking at a snapshot of my memories. "What do you think it is?" I asked him. Mike shrugged. "Honestly, we don't know. Some people think it's Bigfoot. Others say it's some kind of interdimensional being. All we know is that something is out there, and it's not something science can easily explain." After that meeting, I became obsessed. I started going out to that area regularly, hoping to catch another glimpse. I bought a nice camera and some night vision equipment. I even set up some game cameras in the woods near where I'd had my encounters. For months, nothing happened. I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, one night in early spring, everything changed. I was out in the woods, just sitting quietly and observing. It was around midnight, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Suddenly, everything went silent. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite a growl, not quite a roar. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I fumbled for my camera, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. That's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Something massive was moving through the trees about 100 yards away. I raised my camera and started snapping pictures as fast as I could. Through the viewfinder, I could see a large, dark shape weaving between the trees. It moved with an eerie grace for something so big. Suddenly it stopped, and then, slowly, it turned and looked directly at me. Even from that distance I could feel the weight of its gaze. My finger froze on the shutter button. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, faster than I thought possible for something that size, it was gone. Just vanished into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding, too scared to move. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, I practically ran back to my car. I didn't look at the photos until I was safely home, doors locked and lights on. Most of the pictures were blurry or too dark to make out anything. But one was clear. It showed a massive, hair-covered creature, half hidden behind a tree. Its eyes reflected the camera flash, glowing an eerie red. I've shown that picture to a few trusted friends and researchers. Some say it's just a bear, or maybe a guy in a suit. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever is out there in those woods, it's not something that can be easily explained away. Since that night, I haven't gone back to those woods. The encounter left me shaken in a way I can't really describe. It's like, once you've seen something like that, you can't unsee it. It changes the way you look at the world. I still drive down that road sometimes, but I always get this knot in my stomach when I do. I find myself scanning the tree line, half hoping, half dreading that I'll see it again. I don't know what's out there in the woods of Montgomery County. Maybe it's Bigfoot, maybe it's something else entirely. All I know is that it's real and it's out there. And sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear that low, guttural sound echoing across the hills. And I wonder, is it out there right now, watching, waiting? And what would happen if one day, instead of running away, it decided to come closer? Story 4. I was just a kid back in 2000, maybe 14 or 15, when my dad took me on my first real hunting trip up in Grace Harbor County. We'd done some target practice before, but this was the real deal, a chance to bag my first deer and prove myself as a hunter. Looking back now, I wish we'd stuck to shooting paper targets. It was early November, crisp and cold. The mountains were blanketed in fog as we set out before dawn, our breath coming out in little puffs. Dad led the way as we hiked deeper into the forest, moving as quietly as we could through the underbrush. Every so often he'd stop and point out deer tracks or droppings, teaching me how to read the signs. By mid-morning, we'd climbed pretty high up the mountain. The fog had mostly burned off, leaving behind a gloomy, overcast sky. We found a good spot overlooking a small clearing and set up to wait. Dad showed me how to stay perfectly still and keep my eyes peeled for any movement. Hours ticked by with no sign of deer. My legs were starting to cramp up from crouching for so long. Just as I was about to suggest we move to a new spot, I heard something. A rustling in the bushes, too loud to be a squirrel or bird. My heart started racing. This was it, my chance to get my first deer. I raised my rifle, trying to steady my shaking hands as I peered through the scope. But as I scanned the tree line, I couldn't see anything. The rustling got louder, branches snapping as if something big was moving through the forest, way bigger than any deer. Suddenly, a massive branch came hurtling out of the trees, smashing into a trunk just yards from where we were hiding. I nearly dropped my gun in shock. Dad grabbed my shoulder, his face tense as he whispered, "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, another branch came flying out, this one even bigger. It slammed into the ground right in front of us, showering us with dirt and leaves. Now I was really freaking out. This was no deer. Something was throwing those branches deliberately, trying to hit us. Dad pulled me to my feet, both of us instinctively crouching low. "We need to get out of here," he hissed. But as we turned to go, the most horrifying sound I've ever heard in my life split the air. It was like a roar, but deeper and more guttural. The sheer volume of it was insane. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, rattling my bones. For a split second, we just stood there frozen. Then Dad snapped out of it and started shoving me forward. "Run!" he yelled. We took off sprinting down the mountain, branches whipping our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear something massive giving chase. Trees creaked and snapped as it barreled after us. The thundering footsteps were getting closer. I was gasping for air, my legs burning, but pure terror kept me going. Suddenly Dad stumbled, his foot catching on a root. I skidded to a stop, terrified of leaving him behind. As I turned to help him up, I caught a glimpse of our pursuer through the trees. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. Not a bear. This thing was standing on 2 legs. In that moment, my brain just short-circuited. This couldn't be real. Dad scrambled to his feet, yanking me forward again. We kept running, but I could tell the thing was gaining on us. In desperation, Dad spun around and fired several shots into the air. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest. For a heart-stopping moment, everything went silent. Then we heard crashing in the opposite direction. The gunshots must have spooked it. Dad grabbed my arm, and we started moving again, not running flat out now, but still keeping up a fast pace. We hiked for hours, too scared to stop, even when our legs felt like jelly. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had us jumping. Finally, we stumbled out onto the logging road where we'd parked the truck. I've never been so relieved to see anything in my life. As Dad fumbled for the keys with shaking hands, one last sound drifted down from the mountains. It was that same bone-chilling roar, but farther away this time. Almost like a final warning. Don't come back here. We peeled out of there, tires slipping on the gravel road. The whole drive home, we barely said a word. I think we were both trying to process what the hell had just happened. When Mom asked how the hunting trip went, we just mumbled something about not seeing any deer. It was years before I could talk about that day, even with my dad. He never wanted to go back to Grace Harbor, and I sure as hell didn't either. To this day, I break out in a cold sweat if I hear a twig snap in the woods. I know what I saw that day, even if I can't explain it. All I know is there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, and sometimes it's better to leave them alone. I still think about that final roar sometimes. Was it really a warning, or maybe a challenge? Either way, I took the hint. I'll stick to hiking well-marked trails from now on. Thank you very much. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Looking back, I wonder if we were unknowingly trespassing in something's territory that day. The way it threw those branches seemed almost like it was trying to scare us off at first, not actually hurt us. It was only when we didn't leave that things escalated. I've done some research over the years trying to make sense of what happened. I've read other accounts of hunters and hikers having similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to believe. but I know what I experienced was real. Sometimes I find myself staring at maps of Grace Harbor County, tracing the contours of those mountains. Part of me is curious to go back, to try and find answers. But then I remember the sheer terror of that day, the feeling of being hunted. Whatever's out there, it's better left alone. I still go camping and fishing, but never without a healthy dose of respect for the wilderness. There are things out there beyond our understanding. That day taught me that nature isn't just beautiful, it can be terrifying too. I've never told this story publicly before. I guess I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up, but I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. And if sharing my experience can help someone else be more prepared or aware in the wilderness, then it's worth it. To anyone planning a trip into remote areas, especially in the Pacific Northwest, be careful out there. Respect the wilderness and the creatures that call it home. And if you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, don't stick around to investigate. Get out of there as fast as you can. I count myself lucky that we made it out that day. Not everyone who has an encounter like that lives to tell the tale. So I'll keep telling mine, as a reminder that there are still mysteries out there in the world. And sometimes it's best to let them remain mysteries. Story 5. I was a proud member of the 82nd Airborne Division for over a decade, but nothing in my military training could have prepared me for what I encountered on my own property in northern Minnesota last fall. After retiring from active duty, I'd purchased a large plot of heavily wooded land, 120 acres of pristine wilderness where I planned to hunt, fish, and enjoy the solitude of nature. It was early November 2018, and I'd headed out at dawn for some turkey hunting. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as I made my way through the dense forest, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. I'd been out for a couple hours with no luck, so I decided to explore a more remote section of the property I hadn't checked out yet. As I pushed deeper into unfamiliar territory, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet, no birds chirping, no small animals scurrying about. Every snap of a twig under my feet sounded deafening in the eerie silence. My instincts from years of military training were on high alert, telling me something wasn't right. I slowed my pace and moved more cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of danger. That's when I spotted something that made my blood run cold. About 30 yards ahead was what appeared to be a large, carefully camouflaged pit. My mind raced as I approached it warily. This was no natural formation. It had clearly been dug out and concealed with branches and leaves. Crouching down to examine it closer, I estimated it was at least 8 feet deep and 10 feet across. Far too big for any normal animal trap. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this had to have been made by something with intelligence and strength far beyond any creature native to these woods. I stood up quickly, my hand instinctively moving to the hunting rifle slung across my back. My eyes darted around, searching for any other signs of the pit's creator. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My training kicked in, and I dropped into a defensive stance, bringing my rifle up to my shoulder. I scanned the tree line methodically, looking for any sign of movement. For several agonizing minutes, I saw nothing, but I could feel eyes on me, watching my every move. Suddenly, a flash of motion caught my eye about 50 yards to my right. I swung my rifle towards it, heart pounding. What I saw emerging from behind a massive oak tree nearly made me question my sanity. It was bipedal and absolutely massive. I'd estimate close to 7 feet tall, but this was no bear standing on its hind legs. The creature was covered in dark brown, matted fur. Its arms were long and powerfully muscled, ending in hands with opposable thumbs. But it was the face that shook me to my core, unmistakably ape-like, yet with an unsettling intelligence in its eyes as it regarded me. Time seemed to stand still as we stared each other down. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I knew better than to show fear or turn my back. So I held my ground, rifle trained on the creature's broad chest. To my shock, it made no move to attack. It simply observed me with what I can only describe as curiosity. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, I slowly began to back away. The creature's eyes followed my movement, but it remained motionless. When I'd put about 100 yards between us, I turned and began quickly but carefully making my way back towards the edge of my property. I didn't run. Years of training had taught me that fleeing often triggers a predator's chase instinct, but I moved as fast as I safely could through the dense underbrush, constantly looking over my shoulder. To my immense relief, I saw no sign of pursuit. It took me nearly an hour to reach the cleared area around my cabin. Only then did I finally allow myself to lower my rifle and try to process what I'd just experienced. My hands were shaking and my shirt was soaked with cold sweat. I spent the rest of that day and night holed up in my cabin, doors locked and loaded rifle close at hand. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old wooden structure had me bolt upright, certain the creature had found me. As the shock wore off, my analytical military mind kicked in. I went over every detail of the encounter, trying to make sense of it. The pit trap showed clear signs of planning and tool use. The creature's stance and gait were unmistakably bipedal. And those eyes, there was an unsettling intelligence there that went far beyond any animal I'd ever encountered. In the days that followed, I grappled with whether to report what I'd seen. But who would believe me? I had no proof beyond my own testimony, and a part of me felt a strange sense of responsibility to protect whatever it was I'd encountered. It clearly wanted to remain hidden from the world. I've never returned to that remote section of my land, but I often find myself staring out into the woods, wondering what other secrets they might hold. The encounter has forever changed how I view the wilderness and shaken my understanding of what's truly possible in this world. To this day, I struggle to fully explain or understand what I saw that autumn morning in the Minnesota backwoods. Was it some unknown species of primate, a creature out of legend come to life, or something else entirely beyond our current scientific understanding? I may never know the truth. But one thing's for certain, I'll never forget those intelligent eyes staring back at me, full of a wisdom and wildness that both awed and terrified me to my very core. It was a stark reminder that for all our supposed mastery over nature, there are still profound mysteries lurking in the dark corners of our world. Story 6. As I crawled along the highway in Lewis County, Washington, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The temperature gauge on my dash read a bone-chilling 24 degrees. Snow pelted my windshield relentlessly, my wipers barely keeping up. I leaned forward, squinting to see even a few feet in front of my headlights. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my exhausted mind was playing tricks on me. A massive, dark figure suddenly appeared in my high beams, crossing the highway right in front of me. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, feeling the ABS kick in as I skidded on the ice. Time seemed to slow down as I got a better look at whatever it was. This thing was enormous. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall. But it wasn't just the size that unnerved me. It was the way it moved. This creature glided across the road with an eerie, fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It effortlessly vaulted over the 5-foot concrete divider in the center of the highway, as if it weighed nothing at all. The movement was almost ghostly, like it was floating rather than running. As it passed in front of my car, I caught a glimpse of matted, dark fur. Long arms swung at its sides, nearly touching the ground. I only saw it for a few seconds, but the image is seared into my brain. My car finally screeched to a halt, fishtailing slightly on the icy road. I sat there, gripping the wheel, heart pounding out of my chest. Did that really just happen? I blinked hard, trying to process what I'd seen. In the distance, I could see the glow of lights from a rest stop or gas station. The creature's massive silhouette was briefly illuminated as it loped away into the woods. Those few seconds of backlighting confirmed that I wasn't hallucinating. This thing was real. I've seen plenty of supposed Bigfoot photos and videos over the years. I always thought they were obvious hoaxes or just bears mistaken for something else. But what I saw that night, it was different. The fluid, almost supernatural way it moved. The immense size, the inhuman shape of its body. This was no person in a costume and definitely not a bear. For several minutes, I just sat there in shocked silence, my engine idling. Part of me wanted to get out and investigate, to see if I could spot any tracks, but a primal fear kept me rooted to my seat. Eventually, I shakily put the car back in drive and continued on my journey, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the tree line. The rest of the drive was a blur. I white-knuckled it the whole way to Seattle, jumping at every shadow. When I finally arrived at my sister's place, she immediately knew something was wrong. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. I tried to explain what happened, but the words felt hollow. How could I possibly convey the sheer otherworldliness of what I'd witnessed? She clearly thought I was sleep-deprived and seeing things in the storm. Maybe I was. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the internet for similar sightings in the area. I even reached out to some Bigfoot research groups, though I felt ridiculous doing so. Most of the evidence I found was clearly fake or exaggerated, but a few accounts described eerily similar encounters, all in that same stretch of highway. One story in particular stuck with me. A truck driver claimed to have seen an enormous ape-like creature dart across the road in almost the exact same spot, moving with that same uncanny speed and agility. His description matched what I saw almost perfectly. I've always considered myself a rational person. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or conspiracy theories. But that night on the snowy highway shook me to my core. I still can't explain what I saw, but I know it wasn't human. And I know I'll never forget the way it moved, like something not quite of this world. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, especially in bad weather, I find myself scanning the sides of the road. Part of me hopes to catch another glimpse, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But a bigger part dreads the thought of ever encountering that creature again. I've mostly kept this story to myself, afraid of being labeled as some kook or attention seeker. But I feel like I need to share it, if only to see if anyone else has had a similar experience. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone had told me this story before that night, I would have dismissed it immediately. But now I'm not so sure about anything anymore. That snowy night in Washington changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. I don't know if what I saw was truly a Bigfoot or something else entirely. But I know it was real. And I know I'll be looking over my shoulder every time I drive that stretch of highway for the rest of my life. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. In my dreams, I'm back on that icy road, but this time the creature doesn't just cross in front of me. It turns and looks right at me with glowing eyes. I always wake up in a cold sweat, the image of its massive silhouette burned into my retinas. I've tried to rationalize it countless times. Maybe it was just a large bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe the storm and my fatigue caused me to misjudge its size and movement. But deep down, I know that's not the case. What I saw that night was something other. Something that shouldn't exist in our world, but somehow does. The encounter has made me hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially in wooded areas. Every snapping twig or rustling bush makes me tense up. I find myself constantly scanning tree lines, half expecting to see that massive figure again. It's like a part of my brain is always on high alert now, primed to spot something that doesn't belong. I've become somewhat obsessed with researching similar encounters. I've joined online forums and groups dedicated to Bigfoot sightings, though I rarely share my own story. Most of what I read seems far-fetched or clearly fabricated, but occasionally I'll come across an account that sends chills down my spine. Stories that mirror my experience in uncanny ways. One thing that keeps nagging at me is the creature's apparent intelligence. The way it moved across that highway showed a clear understanding of human infrastructure. It knew to vault the concrete barrier rather than try to squeeze through or go around. That level of problem-solving and adaptability is unsettling to think about. I've often wondered why it was out in such horrific weather. Was it simply crossing the road, or was it drawn to the lights of passing cars? The thought that it might have been hunting is too terrifying to dwell on for long. Sometimes I question my own memory of that night. Did I really see what I think I saw? But then I'll close my eyes, and it all comes flooding back. The blinding snow, the icy road, and that massive figure gliding across my path with impossible grace. The memory is as vivid and visceral as the moment it happened. I've thought about going back to that stretch of highway, maybe setting up some trail cameras in the surrounding woods. But something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear of what I might find, or worse, fear of finding nothing at all and being forced to question my own sanity. This experience has changed how I view the world. I used to scoff at stories of the paranormal or cryptids. Now, I'm much more open-minded. If something like what I saw can exist, what else might be out there that we don't understand? I don't know if I'll ever have closure on what happened that night. Part of me hopes I never encounter anything like it again. But another part almost wishes for another sighting, just to prove to myself once and for all that I'm not crazy, that what I saw was real. For now, all I can do is share my story and hope that maybe, just maybe, someone out there has seen something similar. Because the alternative, that I'm alone in this experience, is almost too much to bear. So I put this out there, into the void of the internet, not expecting answers, but hoping for some small validation. If you've seen something like what I described, please reach out. And if you find yourself driving through Louis County, Washington on a snowy night, keep your eyes on the road, but maybe glance at the tree line every now and then. You never know what might be watching from the shadows. Story 7. I was on Highway 12, in that stretch between Malone and Porter. It's a pretty quiet, wooded area, not much traffic that early in the morning. I was in my Subaru Crosstrek, just cruising along and looking forward to getting home and crawling into bed. The road curves a bit there and goes uphill, with some steep embankments on either side. As I came around one of the curves, something caught my eye up on the hillside to my right. At first I thought it was just a weirdly shaped tree or something, but then I realized it was moving. I slowed down a bit, squinting to try and make out what it was in the dim early morning light. That's when I saw it clearly, and my blood ran cold. There was a figure standing there, partially hidden behind a tree about 15 feet up the steep embankment. It was tall, probably around 6 feet, but the proportions were all wrong for a human. The body was muscular but oddly slim, almost stretched-looking. The skin or fur or whatever it was seemed patchy, dark in most places but with some bare lighter areas visible. But the face... God, the face is what really got to me. It was disturbingly human-like, but not quite right. The features were similar to a person's, but exaggerated somehow. The eyes especially. They were huge and dark, and seemed to be staring right at me with an unnerving intelligence. I must have hit the brakes without realizing it, because suddenly I was barely crawling along the highway. For a few endless seconds, the creature and I just stared at each other. I felt frozen, unable to look away or even blink. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a bear? A person in a costume? But I knew it wasn't either of those things. This was something else entirely. Suddenly, as if sensing my growing panic, the creature moved. In one fluid motion, it spun 180 degrees and darted back into the trees. The speed and agility were shocking. 1 second it was there, the next it had vanished into the forest. I've never seen anything move like that before. I sat there in my car for I don't know how long, just staring at the spot where it had been. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. Eventually, a car came up behind me and honked, snapping me out of my daze. I fumbled for my phone and called my husband, barely able to get the words out through my tears. "Babe, you're not going to believe what just happened," I choked out when he answered. I was trembling all over as I tried to describe what I'd seen. He kept asking if I was okay, if I'd been in an accident. I must have sounded hysterical. I managed to pull myself together enough to drive the rest of the way home, but I was on edge the whole time, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. When I got home, my husband was waiting for me, looking worried sick. I collapsed into his arms as soon as I got out of the car, sobbing uncontrollably. We sat on the couch for hours as I recounted every detail I could remember. He listened patiently, holding me and assuring me that he believed me. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. Hell, I barely believed it myself. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have thought it was just a crazy story too. It's been almost a week now, and I still can't shake the feeling of those eyes staring into me. I've been jumpy and on edge, unable to relax. I've barely slept, plagued by nightmares when I do manage to doze off. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees sets my heart racing. I've scoured the internet, looking for any similar sightings or explanations. Nothing quite matches what I saw. I've thought about reporting it, but who would I even tell? The police? Fish and wildlife? I work with law enforcement every day. I know how they'd react to a story like this. They'd think I was nuts or on drugs or something. So I've kept it to myself, turning it over and over in my mind, questioning my own sanity. Was it real? Did I imagine it? Maybe I dozed off at the wheel and had some kind of waking dream. But it felt so viscerally real. I can still picture every detail of that creature with perfect clarity. I've been avoiding Highway 12 since it happened, taking the long way around even though it adds 30 minutes to my commute. Just the thought of driving past that spot again makes me break out in a cold sweat. My husband keeps urging me to see a therapist, worried about how it's affecting me. Maybe he's right. Maybe talking to a professional would help. But a part of me is scared to let it go. As terrifying as the experience was, it was also profound in a way I can't quite articulate. It's like a veil was lifted for a moment, showing me that the world is stranger and more mysterious than I ever imagined. How do you just go back to normal life after something like that? I find myself constantly searching the woods now when I'm outside, half expecting, dreading, to catch another glimpse of that creature. Was it a one-time thing? Are there more out there? What was it doing on that hillside that morning? So many questions that I'll probably never get answers to. I'm not sure why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I just need to get it off my chest, to tell someone who won't look at me like I'm crazy. Maybe I'm hoping someone else out there has seen something similar and can help me make sense of it. Or maybe I just need reassurance that I'm not losing my mind. All I know is that my worldview has been shattered. I used to think I had a pretty good grasp on reality, on what was and wasn't possible. Now I'm not so sure. If this creature exists, What else might be out there that we don't know about? It's both terrifying and oddly thrilling to contemplate. For now, I'm just trying to process it all and find a way to move forward. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to look at those woods the same way again. Every time I drive past, I'll be searching the tree line, wondering what might be watching from the shadows. And a small part of me will always be back on that highway, locked in that moment of impossible eye contact with something that shouldn't exist. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what I saw that morning, but I know that I'll never forget it as long as I live. That face, those eyes, they're seared into my memory forever. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, it changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. All I can do now is try to find a way to live with this new reality and hope that someday I'll find some answers. Until then, I'll keep watching the woods and wondering what other secrets they might be hiding. And if you're ever driving down Highway 12 in the early morning hours, keep your eyes on the hillsides. You never know what you might see. Story 8. My wife and I had just settled in for the evening. It was around 10 p.m., and we were curled up on the couch watching some mindless reality TV show. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows and making the house creak. Typical winter weather for the Pacific Northwest. Suddenly we heard a loud thump against the garage door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again and again. It wasn't random. There was a distinct pattern to it, almost like something was deliberately hitting the door. I muted the TV and we sat in silence, listening. The thumping continued, growing more insistent. My wife grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" she whispered. I tried to play it cool, even though my heart was racing. "Probably just a branch blown by the wind," I said, not believing it myself. I got up to investigate, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. As I approached the garage, the thumping stopped. I hesitated at the door, my hand on the knob. Part of me didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was on the other side. But I steeled myself and slowly turned the handle. The garage was dark and silent. I swept the flashlight beam around, half expecting to see someone, or something, hiding in the shadows. But there was nothing out of place, just our cars and the usual garage clutter. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something odd. The camper shell on my pickup truck was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered latching it securely earlier that day when I'd put some camping gear away. As I moved closer to investigate, I heard a soft thud from inside the truck bed. My blood ran cold. Something was in there. I debated what to do. Should I open it and confront whatever it was, or run back inside and call the police? Before I could decide, I heard my wife scream from inside the house. I sprinted back, my heart pounding. "What is it? What happened?" I asked as I burst through the door. She was standing by the living room window, her face pale. "I saw eyes," she said, her voice shaking. 3 pairs of glowing eyes, watching the house. I joined her at the window, peering out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing. Then, in the tree line at the edge of our property, I caught a glimpse of something that made my skin crawl. 2 sets of eyes, reflecting the light from our porch. One set was about 6 feet off the ground, the other closer to 5 feet. But what really chilled me to the bone was the third set, towering above the others at what had to be over 8 feet high. We stood there, frozen in fear, watching these eyes observe us. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or 2, they slowly retreated into the forest. Neither of us slept that night. We sat up, lights on, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside to investigate. The wet grass in our backyard was trampled, with clear tracks leading from the forest to our house. But these weren't any tracks I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide, Whatever made them was massive and definitely not human. I took photos and measurements, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't know what to do with this information. Who would believe us? Over the next few weeks, the activity continued. We'd hear strange vocalizations at night, not quite human, not quite animal. Sometimes it sounded like they were communicating with each other. Then, about a month after that first night, we saw them. It was around 2 a.m., and I'd gotten up to use the bathroom. As I was heading back to bed, movement in the backyard caught my eye. There, illuminated by the motion-activated security light, were 4 figures. One was enormous, easily 8 feet tall and covered in dark, shaggy hair. The other 3 were smaller, maybe 5-6 feet tall, but with the same build and fur. They moved with an eerie grace, almost gliding across the yard. The big ones seemed to be leading the smaller ones, showing them something. I watched, paralyzed, as they examined our grill, peered in our windows, and even picked up and inspected our lawn furniture. I wanted to wake my wife, to have her see this too, but I was afraid any movement would alert them to my presence. So I stood there, barely breathing, watching these creatures explore our yard like it was some kind of educational field trip. At one point, the largest one looked directly at our bedroom window. Even though the lights were off and I was hidden in shadow, I swear it knew I was there. It cocked its head to the side, studying me. I felt like it was looking right into my soul. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes or so, they melted back into the forest. I slumped to the floor, my legs weak, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The next morning, I told my wife what I'd seen. She believed me. After what we'd experienced already, how could she not? We decided to try an experiment. That night, we left out some peanut butter jars in the yard. We figured if these were animals, they'd be attracted to the food. When we checked the next morning, the jars were gone. Not just opened or eaten from, but completely removed. We searched the entire property but never found them. This pattern continued for weeks. We'd leave out food, and it would vanish without a trace. Sometimes we'd hear them at night, moving around outside. Other times, we'd catch glimpses of eyes watching from the forest. We debated telling someone, the police, a local news station, anyone. But we were afraid of not being believed, of being labeled as crazy. And, if I'm being honest, afraid of what might happen if we drew too much attention to these creatures. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it all stopped. No more sounds at night, no more missing food, no more eyes in the forest. It was like they had never been there at all. It's been years now, and we've never told anyone the full story until now. We've moved away from ocean shores, too shaken by our experiences to stay. But I still think about those nights, about what we saw. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what we experienced. There's something out there in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, something that defies explanation. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear those strange vocalizations carried on the wind, calling me back to ocean shores. Story 9. I was sitting on my deck, about 11 feet off the ground, enjoying the cool night air. The stars were out, and there was a gentle breeze. It was the kind of perfect summer night that makes you appreciate living on the coast. I had a book and a glass of wine, just unwinding after a long day. Around 10:30 p.m., I started hearing some strange noises coming from the wooded area behind my house. At first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but then I realized it sounded more like an animal in distress. As I listened closer, I could make out what sounded like a rabbit screaming. It was an awful, high-pitched, shrieking sound that sent chills down my spine. I sat up straighter, suddenly on edge. We occasionally got coyotes and other predators in the area, but something about this didn't sound right. The screaming went on for several long minutes. I debated going inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see if I could spot what was happening. That's when I noticed movement at the edge of the woods. Something large was moving through the underbrush, much bigger than a coyote. My heart started racing as I strained my eyes to make out what it was in the dim light. Suddenly, this massive shape emerged from the tree line. Even in the darkness, I could tell it was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall and incredibly broad. It moved in a strange loping gait on 2 legs. I froze in terror, unable to fully process what I was seeing. The creature paused at the edge of my yard, seeming to survey the area. That's when I noticed the lower deck beneath me. It was just a small false deck we'd built as a decorative feature, only about 4 feet off the ground. To my horror, I realized it created a perfect stepping stone up to where I was sitting. Before I could even think to move, the thing bounded across the yard with shocking speed and agility. In 2 massive strides, it reached the lower deck. I watched in disbelief as it effortlessly pulled itself up onto it. Now it was directly below me, barely 7 feet from where I sat, paralyzed with fear. I could hear its labored breathing and smell a musty, wild odor. It tilted its head back, and I swear I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't make out any facial features in the darkness. I wanted desperately to run inside, but I was terrified any movement would provoke it to attack. So I stayed absolutely still, barely daring to breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but far too large and muscular to be a person. The proportions were all wrong: long arms, a sloping head, broad shoulders. Was this some kind of bear? But bears don't stand upright like that. Suddenly, it took a deep, rattling breath through what must have been massive nostrils. The sound sent ice through my veins. It was sniffing the air, trying to catch my scent. I realized with horror that the breeze was blowing directly from me to it. There was no way it couldn't smell me. I had an old flashlight sitting on the table next to me. With trembling fingers, I slowly reached for it, praying I could shine it in the creature's eyes and startle it away. But when I clicked the switch, nothing happened. The batteries were dead. That tiny click of the flashlight seemed deafening in the tense silence. The creature's head snapped up at the sound, staring directly at me. I caught a brief glimpse of glowing eyes reflecting what little moonlight there was. That was it. My nerve broke. I leapt up from my chair and bolted for the sliding glass door, fumbling with the handle in panic. I could hear heavy footsteps on the deck behind me as I finally wrenched the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut and locking it. I ran through the house, locking every door and window before huddling in my bedroom with all the lights on. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. When the police finally arrived 20 minutes later, they found no sign of the creature, but there were strange, massive footprints in the soft earth of my flower beds. In the days that followed, I learned that other people in the area had reported similar sightings. An investigator came out to look at my property and pointed out how the dense vegetation around my house created the perfect cover for something large to hide and watch the house undetected. The thought made my skin crawl. I ended up selling that house and moving into town. To this day, I can't explain what I saw that night. Was it some undiscovered species? A creature out of legend? I don't know. But I do know that I'll never forget those terrifying moments on my deck, feeling the hot breath of something impossible right beneath my feet. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the sound of those heavy footsteps coming up behind me as I ran. Whatever it was real, and it was right there, inches away from me in the darkness. I don't know why it didn't attack. Maybe it was just curious. But I thank my lucky stars every day that I made it inside alive. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just a large bear, and my fear distorted my perception. But deep down, I know that's not true. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, this was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to make sense of what happened. I've read about other encounters, looked at blurry photos and disputed footage. Nothing quite matches what I saw. But I know now that I'm not alone in having experienced something like this. There are others out there who've seen things they can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know about the world. I don't talk about it much. Most people would think I was crazy. But I know what I saw. And I know that there are things out there in the woods that defy explanation. I still love nature, still go hiking and camping. But I'm much more cautious now. I'm always aware of my surroundings, always listening for anything out of place. And I never ever sit out on a deck at night anymore. Some fears stick with you forever. To anyone reading this who's had a similar experience, you're not alone. And to those who haven't, count yourself lucky. There are things in this world that we don't understand. Things that challenge everything we think we know. I hope you never have to come face to face with them like I did. But if you do, trust your instincts. And whatever you do, don't freeze up like I did. Run. Run as fast as you can. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to get inside in time. Would it have climbed up onto my deck? Would it have attacked me? Or was it just curious, investigating this strange human in its territory? I'll never know. And honestly, I'm glad I don't. The investigator who came out afterwards said that my experience fit the pattern of other reported sightings in the area. Apparently, the coastal forests of Washington are a hotspot for this kind of activity. He showed me maps of other encounters, all clustered around the same general area. What really got to me was when he pointed out how perfect my property was for these creatures. The dense trees, the elevation changes, the clear sight lines to the house. It was like my deck was a perfect observation post for something wanting to watch humans undetected. Had it been watching me for days or weeks before that night? The thought still makes me shudder. I've tried to move on with my life, to put that night behind me. But every now and then, something will trigger the memory. The sound of branches breaking in the woods, a strange smell on the wind, a shadow moving just at the edge of my vision. And it all comes rushing back. I know there are skeptics out there who would say I imagined it all, or that I'm making it up for attention. But I know what I experienced. It was real, it was terrifying, and it changed my entire worldview. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that challenge our understanding of reality. To anyone who's reading this and doubting, I hope you never have to experience anything like what I did. But if you do, remember my story. Don't freeze up. Don't try to rationalize it away in the moment. Just get to safety as fast as you can. You can try to make sense of it later, when you're out of danger. And to anyone who has had a similar encounter, you're not crazy. What you saw was real. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. There's more to this world than we understand. Sometimes, that truth reveals itself in terrifying ways. I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling hot breath on my skin and hearing heavy footsteps behind me. But then I remind myself that I'm safe now. I made it out. I survived. But a part of me will always wonder, what if I hadn't? What if I'd been a second slower getting to that door? What was that creature planning to do? I guess I'll never know. And maybe that's for the best. All I know is that my view of the world changed forever that night. There are things out there in the darkness, things we can't explain, things that shouldn't exist, and sometimes they get way too close for comfort. So be careful out there, and always, always trust your instincts. They might just save your life. Story 10. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or cryptids, but after what happened to me in Ocean Shores back in 2012, I'm not so sure anymore. It still haunts me to this day, and I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was a crisp December afternoon, around 2 p.m. I was in my backyard, raking up the last of the fall leaves before winter fully set in. The air had that sharp, clean scent that only comes with the changing of seasons. As I worked, I kept an eye on the tree line at the edge of my property. We often got deer wandering through, and I enjoyed watching them go about their business. Sure enough, I spotted movement near the trees. At first, I assumed it was just the usual small herd passing through, but as I focused my gaze, I realized something was off. There were 3 deer, moving calmly as they always did, but behind them was something else, something big. I froze, rake still in hand, as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was a massive, furry form, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. The fur was a mottled brown color, blending in with the winter bare trees. It moved with an odd gait, almost shambling, yet somehow graceful. The strangest part was how the deer seemed completely unbothered by its presence. They continued grazing and ambling along, as if this giant creature was just part of the scenery. I stood there, barely breathing, as the bizarre procession made its way across my yard and disappeared into the trees on the other side. Once they were gone, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd just witnessed. Maybe it was just a really big bear. But bears don't walk upright like that, and they certainly don't peacefully coexist with deer. I tried to convince myself I was seeing things, that the winter light had played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I didn't tell anyone about the incident. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. I tried to go about my days normally, but I found myself constantly glancing out windows, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. A week passed, and the memory began to fade. I started to think maybe I really had imagined it after all. Then came January 3rd, the day that changed everything. I'd decided to clear a new hiking trail through the wooded area of my property. It was dense with undergrowth, and I figured the physical labor would help clear my mind of lingering thoughts about the strange sighting. I'd been working for a couple of hours, using a machete to hack through the thick brush. The repetitive motion was almost meditative, and I'd fallen into a steady rhythm. Chop, step, chop, step. I was so focused on the task at hand that I almost didn't notice when the forest around me went suddenly, deathly quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I paused, machete half raised, straining my ears for any sound. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl coming from just ahead of me. My blood ran cold. My first thought was, bear, and I started to slowly back away. But as I moved, I caught a glimpse of movement through the foliage. What I saw made my heart nearly stop. Not 10 feet away from me was a massive, fur-covered form. It was on all fours, crawling along the forest floor with an unnatural, fluid grace. The fur was a mix of brown and silver, matted in some places and hanging in long strands in others. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature slowly raised its head. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew this was no bear. The eyes were too intelligent, too human. Yet at the same time, they were utterly alien, filled with a wildness I'd never seen before. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, in one swift, impossible motion, the creature rose to its full height. It towered over me, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. Its arms hung long at its sides, massive hands ending in wickedly curved claws. That's when the smell hit me. It was an overpowering stench of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify, something ancient and primal that spoke to the deepest, most primitive part of my brain. It screamed danger louder than any words ever could. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was frozen in place, the next I was crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I fled in blind panic. I could hear it behind me, the sound of heavy footfalls and snapping branches. Somehow, I made it back to my house. I slammed the door behind me, fumbling with trembling hands to lock it. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. For hours, I sat there, jumping at every little sound. As the adrenaline wore off, I began to process what had happened. I knew I needed to tell someone, but who would believe me? Eventually, I decided to call the police. At least they'd have a record of the incident, even if they thought I was crazy. When the officers arrived, I could tell they were skeptical. They took my statement, but I saw the looks they exchanged. They clearly thought I was either drunk or delusional. They did a cursory search of the property, but found nothing out of the ordinary. In the days and weeks that followed, I became obsessed with researching similar encounters. I learned about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other cryptid sightings. So many of the details matched what I'd experienced. The size, the smell, the intelligent eyes. I've never seen the creature again, but I know it's out there. Sometimes, late at night, I hear strange noises coming from the woods. Heavy footsteps that are too big to be human, but move with a rhythm that's not quite animal either. I've thought about moving, about selling the property and getting as far away from ocean shores as I can. But something keeps me here. Maybe it's a desire to see it again, to prove to myself and the world that I'm not crazy. Or maybe it's fear that if I leave, I'll be forever looking over my shoulder, wondering if it's followed me. All I know is that my encounter that day changed me forever. I used to think I understood the world, that science had explained everything there was to explain. Now I'm not so sure. There are things out there, lurking in the shadows of our so-called civilized world, that defy explanation. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone. And I always carry a camera, hoping to capture proof of what I saw. So far, I've had no luck. But I know it's out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is full, I swear I can hear its call echoing through the trees, a reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that we may never fully understand. Story 11. It was a mild afternoon, and I'd decided to reorganize some of the potted plants near the north corner of the house. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just me, surrounded by nature, with the soothing sounds of birds chirping in the distance. That tranquility was shattered when my neighbor's dog started going absolutely ballistic. I'm talking full-on, frenzied barking like I'd never heard before. It was so loud and intense that it made me jump. At first I was just annoyed. I shouted over in that direction, telling the mutt to pipe down. But something about the way that dog was carrying on, it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and get back to what I was doing. But then I noticed the vegetation around me start to move, and I don't mean a gentle rustling from a breeze. This was violent thrashing, like something massive was plowing through the underbrush. My heart started racing as I scanned the tree line, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. That's when I heard it, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It was primal and terrifying, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This was no bear or mountain lion. The sheer power behind that sound, I knew instantly I was dealing with something far beyond the norm. I stood there frozen for a split second, my mind reeling. Then survival instinct kicked in, and I bolted for the storage shed where I keep my shotgun. As I ran, I could feel the ground literally shaking beneath my feet. Each thunderous footstep was like a small earthquake. Boom, boom, boom. The raw strength it would take to make the earth tremble like that. I don't even want to think about it. With trembling hands, I fumbled to load the shotgun. I could hear branches snapping and vegetation being torn apart as whatever it was continued to move through the area. The sounds were getting closer. It sounded like a full-grown buffalo was charging around out there, except I knew it had to be something much, much bigger. I posted up inside the shed, shotgun at the ready, barely daring to breathe. Minutes felt like hours as I strained my ears, trying to track the creature's movements. Eventually, the sounds began to fade as it moved further away, but I stayed put for a long time after that, too terrified to venture out. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the shed, the yard was eerily quiet. The dog had stopped barking. There were no birds singing. It was like all wildlife in the area was laying low. I did a quick scan of the property, but didn't see any signs of the creature. No footprints, no broken fences, nothing concrete I could point to as proof of what had happened. I spent a restless night jumping at every little sound, convinced the thing was going to come back. By the next day, I'd started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was working too hard, too stressed out. I tried to rationalize it away. But 2 days later, I knew for certain it hadn't been my imagination. I woke up to the most god-awful stench permeating my entire house. It was this musky, skunky odor, but way more pungent than any skunk I'd ever encountered. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I searched the property but couldn't find any dead animals or other source for the smell. And that's when it hit me. This was the creature's scent. It had come back, marking its territory, letting me know I was in its domain now. I've lived with a low-grade terror ever since that day. I've beefed up security, installed motion sensor lights, the works. But I know deep down none of that would stop this thing if it decided to come back. The worst part is not knowing what exactly I encountered or why it was here or if it'll return. Every rustle of leaves sets me on edge now. Every unexplained sound in the night has me reaching for my gun. I've tried talking to a few people about what happened, but most just look at me like I'm crazy. And maybe I am. But I know what I experienced. That roar, those footsteps, that smell, it was all too real. Something is out there in these woods, something big, something powerful. And I pray to God I never come face to face with it again. I keep replaying that day over and over, analyzing every detail. Could I have done anything differently? Should I have tried to get a look at the creature? Part of me is glad I didn't see it clearly. I'm not sure my mind could handle knowing exactly what it was. But another part of me desperately wants answers. I've become obsessed with researching local legends, trying to find any similar accounts. I've pored over Native American folklore, looking for clues. But nothing quite matches up to what I experienced. This was something other, something that shouldn't exist in our world. The incident has changed me in ways I'm still coming to terms with. I used to love being outdoors, spending time in nature. Now I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I've considered moving, but where would I go? How do I know it won't follow me? And honestly, a part of me feels like I need to stay, to keep watch, to be ready if it comes back. I find myself constantly on alert now, hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every shadow seems menacing. Every unexpected sound makes me flinch. I've developed insomnia, spending nights staring out the window, watching for any sign of movement in the darkness. The few times I've ventured into the woods since then, I've felt watched. Like there are eyes on me, tracking my every move. It's probably just paranoia, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone out there. I've started keeping a journal, documenting everything I can remember about that day. and any strange occurrences since then. Maybe someday it'll help shed light on what's really going on here, or maybe it'll just be evidence of my descent into madness. There are moments when I almost convince myself it was all a vivid hallucination, but then I'll catch a whiff of that distinctive musky odor on the wind, or hear a distant sound that's just a little too similar to that earth-shaking roar, and I know it was real. It happened, and it could happen again. I often wonder if anyone else in the area has had similar experiences. Are there others out there, silently dealing with their own encounters? Or am I alone in this nightmare? Sometimes I think about going public with my story, but who would believe me? And what if drawing attention to it somehow provokes the creature? So I stay quiet, vigilant, always waiting for the next sign, always wondering when, not if, I'll have another encounter. Because deep down, I know this isn't over. Whatever that thing was, wherever it came from, it's still out there. And for some reason, it chose my property, my little corner of the world, to make its presence known. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'll never forget that day in March 2014, the day everything changed, the day I realized the world is a much stranger, much more terrifying place than I ever imagined. And now, I live with the constant knowledge that at any moment, my reality could once again be shattered by something beyond my comprehension. Story 12. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. It was a crisp autumn morning in Ocean Shores, and I had decided to take my dog for an early walk in the woods behind our house. The air was cool and misty as we set out, fallen leaves crunching underfoot. We followed our usual trail for about 20 minutes, Buddy sniffing excitedly at every bush and tree. As we rounded a bend, I noticed an overgrown clearing up ahead, an old vacant lot I'd never paid much attention to before. Something made me pause at the edge of the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. Buddy stopped too, his ears pricked forward alertly. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I squinted through the morning haze, I realized this was something different. It was crouched over what looked like a deer carcass about 50 yards away. The creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even hunched over. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, but it had no tail that I could see. I watched in stunned silence as it tore into the deer with terrifying strength. The sound of ripping flesh and crunching bone carried clearly through the still air. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the deer was still alive, weakly kicking its legs. This thing was eating it alive. Suddenly the creature stood upright on 2 legs, holding half the deer carcass in its arms. I gasped involuntarily. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, not quite human, not quite animal. Its face was flattened and ape-like, with a protruding brow ridge and wide, flaring nostrils. But there was an unsettling intelligence in its eyes that made my blood run cold. As if sensing my presence, it whipped its head in my direction. Those eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I felt like prey. They were dark and penetrating, filled with a predatory hunger that rooted me to the spot. I couldn't look away. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, it turned and loped off into the trees. It moved with an odd, lumbering gait, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on all 4s. In moments it had vanished into the shadows, taking a large portion of the deer with it. I stood there shaking for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Buddy was whimpering and tugging at his leash, eager to get away from there. Finally, I snapped out of my daze and hurried home as fast as my legs would carry me. For days afterward, I was jumpy and on edge, jumping at every little sound outside. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of it. I've lived in these woods my whole life and know every animal that calls them home. But this was something else entirely. I did some research online and came across stories of Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. While I'd always been skeptical of that sort of thing, I have to admit the descriptions matched closely with what I saw. The size, the fur, the face, the way it moved, it all fits. It's been months now, and I still get chills thinking about that morning. I avoid that part of the woods entirely these days. Sometimes at night, I lie awake straining to hear any unusual sounds outside. I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. Those eyes haunt my dreams. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day, and it's changed how I see the world. There are things out there beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows of the wild places. I just pray I never encounter one again. I've debated whether or not to report this to anyone official. Part of me wants answers, wants to know if others have seen similar things. But another part of me is afraid of being labeled as crazy or attracting unwanted attention. So for now I've kept it to myself, turning it over and over in my mind. The image of that creature is seared into my memory, the raw power of its movements, the intelligence in its eyes, the casual brutality as it tore apart its prey. It was like glimpsing something primordial, something that shouldn't exist in our modern world. Yet there it was, as real as you or me. I find myself obsessively scanning the tree line whenever I'm outside now, my eyes straining for any hint of movement. Every shadow takes on a menacing shape. The woods I once found peaceful now feel oppressive and alien. I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I heard heavy footsteps outside my window. Other times I dream of those piercing eyes boring into me, filled with predatory hunger. I've taken to sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, though I doubt it would do much good against a creature of that size and strength. I've tried talking to my wife about it, but she just gives me concerned looks and suggests I see a therapist. Maybe she's right. Maybe the stress of my job has finally gotten to me, and I'm losing my grip on reality. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The worst part is the not knowing. Is it still out there? Was it a one-time thing, or does it regularly hunt in these woods? Are there more of them? The questions gnaw at me constantly. I find myself poring over maps of the area, trying to track deer populations and figure out where it might be living. I've become obsessed with researching similar encounters, spending hours reading eyewitness accounts online. So many of them echo my own experience. The size, the appearance, the chilling intelligence in its eyes. It both comforts and terrifies me to know I'm not alone in what I've seen. Some days I consider moving away, leaving these woods and the memories behind. But another part of me feels a strange compulsion to stay, to try to catch another glimpse and confirm I'm not going crazy. It's like the encounter awakened something primal in me, a connection to the ancient wildness that still lurks at the edges of our world. I don't know if I'll ever have answers or find peace with what happened that day. All I know is that it fundamentally changed me and how I see the world around me. The boundary between the known and unknown, between reality and myth, has become blurred, and in the shadows of the forest, something is watching and waiting. Story 13. As I pulled up to the secluded property, nestled between dense forest and the misty coastline, an eerie feeling settled over me. The owners, a middle-aged couple, greeted me with nervous smiles and ushered me inside their cozy beachfront home. Over cups of steaming coffee, they began to recount the bizarre events that had been plaguing their peaceful retreat. It started with small things, the wife explained, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. Food would disappear from our porch. At first, we thought it was raccoons or maybe even bears, but then things got weirder. Her husband nodded gravely. We started leaving food out on purpose, in specific spots around the property. Sometimes it would vanish without a trace. Other times it'd be left untouched for days. I listened intently, jotting down notes and trying to maintain a professional demeanor despite the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. As they continued their tale, the pieces of this puzzling situation began to fall into place, forming a picture that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The couple went on to describe how they had attempted to capture evidence of whatever was taking the food. "We set up a trail camera," the husband said, leaning forward with an intense look in his eyes, "covered it with grass to keep it hidden. But when we came back to check it a few days later, the grass had been carefully removed, and there was nothing, not a single image, on the camera." My mind raced with possibilities. What kind of creature was intelligent enough to spot a hidden camera and disable it without leaving any trace? The implications were unsettling, to say the least. Determined to gather more information, I suggested we take a walk around the property. As we stepped outside, the cool ocean breeze carried with it a sense of foreboding. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We made our way through the lush greenery that separated the various properties in the area. It was then that I noticed something odd, barely visible trails winding through the vegetation. These weren't your typical animal paths. They were strategic, offering clear sightlines to the houses while remaining hidden from view. "Have you noticed these trails before?" I asked the couple, trying to keep my voice steady. They exchanged worried glances before shaking their heads. "No," the wife whispered. "I've never seen those before." As we continued our investigation, I couldn't help but feel like we were being observed from the shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig set my nerves on edge. I've dealt with my fair share of strange cases, but this was different. There was an intelligence at work here, something that defied easy explanation. Our walk led us to a beautifully landscaped area near the house, where river rocks had been artfully arranged. But something caught my eye. Several of the larger stones appeared to have been moved recently. "Do you often rearrange these rocks?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. The couple looked puzzled. "No," the husband replied. "We haven't touched them since we had the landscaping done last year." I crouched down to examine the rocks more closely. The indentations in the soil where they had originally rested were still visible, confirming that they had indeed been moved. But why? And more importantly, by what? As I stood up, a chill ran down my spine. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that was as incredible as it was terrifying. The missing food, the disabled camera, the hidden trails, and now these mysteriously moved rocks, all pointed to a presence that was both intelligent and elusive. I turned to face the nervous couple, struggling to find the right words to explain my suspicions without sounding completely insane. "I think," I began slowly, "that you may be dealing with something unusual here. Something that many people believe is just a myth." Their eyes widened as realization dawned. "You don't mean—" the wife gasped, unable to finish her sentence. I nodded grimly. "Yes, I believe we may be looking at evidence of Sasquatch activity." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I half expected them to laugh, to dismiss the idea outright. But instead, they both paled visibly, as if my suggestion had confirmed their deepest unspoken fears. As if on cue, a loud crash echoed from the forest behind us. We all whirled around, hearts pounding. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a large, dark figure moving between the trees, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. "We need to get back to the house," I said urgently, ushering the couple ahead of me. As we hurried back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. that something was watching our every move from just beyond the tree line. Once safely inside, we spent the next few hours discussing what I had observed and what it could mean. I shared some of my knowledge about Sasquatch behavior, explaining how the evidence we'd found aligned with reported sightings and encounters. As night fell, I reluctantly prepared to leave. The couple begged me to stay, clearly shaken by the day's events, but I assured them I would return the next day to continue the investigation. The drive back to my hotel was tense. Every shadow on the road seemed to hide potential danger, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, sleep eluded me as my mind raced with the implications of what I had discovered. The next morning I returned to the property, armed with more sophisticated equipment and a determination to uncover the truth. But as I pulled up to the house, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. The entire area where we had walked the day before was in disarray. Trees had been uprooted, the carefully arranged rocks scattered wildly across the lawn. And there, pressed into the soft earth, was a single, massive footprint, far larger than any human foot could make. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything, taking photographs and measurements, and interviewing the shaken couple. But despite our best efforts, we found no further concrete evidence of the creature's presence. It was as if it had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a lingering sense of unease. As I packed up my equipment that evening, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and fear. I had come to Ocean Shores expecting a routine investigation, but I was leaving with evidence that could potentially change everything we thought we knew about the natural world. The case remains open, and I find myself returning to Ocean Shores frequently, hoping to catch another glimpse of the elusive creature, but so far it has remained hidden, leaving us with nothing but theories and the nagging feeling that we are not alone in these woods. To this day, I can't explain everything I saw and experienced during that investigation. But one thing is certain. Whatever is out there in the forests of Ocean Shores, it's far more intelligent and elusive than anything I've ever encountered before. And somehow, that makes it all the more terrifying. Story 14. But last night, God, I don't even know how to explain what happened. I'm still shaken up just thinking about it. It was a pretty typical evening at first. I finished up dinner around 9 p.m. and headed out to the deck with my pack of smokes like usual. It was a clear night, lots of stars visible. There was a slight chill in the air, but nothing too bad. I lit up my cigarette and just stood there for a while, looking out at the trees behind my property and listening to the distant sound of the waves. I was about halfway through my smoke when I heard it. This sound, coming from the southeast, somewhere in the woods. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind, or some kind of bird I hadn't heard before, but then it got louder, and I realized this was something entirely different. It's hard to describe exactly what it sounded like. The closest I can come is to say it was like a mournful wail, a long, drawn-out wah noise that sent chills down my spine. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard either. I froze in place, my cigarette forgotten between my fingers. Every hair on my body was standing on end. The sound came again, louder this time. Where? It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I don't know how long I stood there paralyzed, listening to that awful wailing noise. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Eventually I snapped out of it enough to hurry back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every little sound. I kept expecting to hear that wailing again, but there was nothing, just the normal nighttime noises I was used to. When morning finally came, I felt a little silly for getting so worked up. I told myself I must have imagined it, or maybe misheard something ordinary. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I'd heard was real, and it was unlike anything I've ever experienced before. I tried to go about my day normally, but I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. It kept replaying in my head. I found myself jumping at sudden noises and glancing nervously out the windows. By that evening, I was a nervous wreck. The thought of going out on the deck again filled me with dread. But I also felt this compulsion to try and hear it again, to prove to myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. So around 9 p.m., I reluctantly stepped out onto the deck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely light my cigarette. I stood there rigid, every sense on high alert, straining to hear anything unusual. For a long time there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the night. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it really had been a one-time thing. And then I heard it, that same haunting wah cry coming from the southeast again. My blood ran cold. This time there was no doubt in my mind. This was real, and it was close. The wailing continued, rising and falling in pitch. Sometimes it sounded further away, sometimes alarmingly close. I wanted to run back inside, but I was rooted to the spot in terror. And then I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. Movement in the tree line at the edge of my property. Something large, moving on 2 legs. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out a massive, hair-covered form. It stepped partially out of the trees, and I got a glimpse of a face that will haunt my nightmares forever. It was almost human-like, but wrong. The proportions were off, the features bestial, and the eyes. God, the eyes. They seemed to glow with an inner light as they fixed directly on me. I don't remember screaming, but I must have because my throat was raw afterwards. I ran inside and locked every door and window, then huddled in my bedroom closet until dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside the next morning, there was no sign of the creature. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. If it weren't for the lingering terror I felt, I might have convinced myself it was all a vivid nightmare. I spent the next few days in a daze, barely sleeping and jumping at every sound. I couldn't bring myself to go out on the deck again after dark. The few times I ventured outside during the day, I felt like I was being watched from the woods. It's been about a week now since that night. I haven't heard the wailing again or seen any other signs of whatever that thing was. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. I've tried to rationalize it, to come up with some logical explanation. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something in these woods that defies explanation. Something that shouldn't exist but does. I've lived here for years and never experienced anything like this before. But now that I have, I can't unsee it. Can't unhear that terrible wailing cry. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified to stay here, but also scared to leave in case that thing follows me. And who would believe me if I tried to tell them? I sound crazy even to myself. So I'm just existing, going through the motions of daily life while constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, straining to hear that sound again. I know it's out there, waiting, and I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before I hear that haunting wah cry again. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe here again. The peace and quiet I used to love now feels ominous and threatening. Every rustle in the trees, every snapping twig makes my heart race. I've started researching online, trying to find any similar reports or experiences, and I've found a few. Whispered stories of strange creatures in the Pacific Northwest, sightings of massive hair-covered beings in the woods. Most people dismiss them as hoaxes or misidentifications, but I know better now. There's something out there in these woods, something that defies explanation or categorization, and it knows I've seen it. I can only hope that by sharing my story, maybe someone else out there who's had a similar experience will reach out, because right now I feel terrifyingly alone with this knowledge. I don't know what the future holds. Will I see that creature again? Will I hear that bone-chilling wail in the night? Or will it remain a mystery, leaving me to doubt my own senses and sanity? All I know is that my peaceful life in ocean shores has been shattered. The world suddenly seems much bigger, much stranger, and much more dangerous than I ever realized. And I'll never look at the woods behind my house the same way again. Story 15. It was supposed to be a relaxing week-long vacation at my family's beach house. We hadn't been there in years, but I remembered it fondly from childhood trips. The house sits on a quiet street, surrounded by other vacation homes that are mostly empty outside of peak season. I arrived late on a Sunday evening in early June, looking forward to some peaceful alone time before my girlfriend joined me later in the week. As I pulled up to the house, I immediately noticed how overgrown everything had become. The surrounding vegetation was wild and unkempt, creating a sense of isolation, even though there were other houses nearby. It was darker than I remembered too, hardly any streetlights, and the dense foliage blocked out most of the moonlight. I lugged my bags inside and got settled, but something felt off. The house creaked and groaned in the night breeze. Shadows seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, chalking it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. The next day, I decided to take a walk and reacquaint myself with the area. The streets were eerily quiet. I didn't see a single other person out and about. As I wandered further from the house, I noticed how the undergrowth between properties had grown into thick, impenetrable walls of vegetation. In some spots, it almost looked like there were tunnel-like openings in the dense brush. I peered into one of these openings, trying to see where it led. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I sensed something moving in the shadows. Before I could get a good look, a chorus of birds suddenly erupted in alarm calls from the trees above. I stumbled backwards, heart racing, and hurried back to the house. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound had me on edge. Branches scraping against windows, floorboards creaking, something scurrying in the walls. Around 2 a.m., I heard heavy footsteps outside, like something large was walking down the street. I froze in bed, hardly daring to breathe. The steps paused right in front of the house. Minutes ticked by in tense silence before they continued on. The next morning, I examined the street, but found no obvious tracks or signs of what I'd heard. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I stood there, movement caught my eye. Someone, or something, ducking behind a hedge down the block. I called out, but got no response. Determined to find a rational explanation, I spent the day exploring the neighborhood more thoroughly. I discovered more of those tunnel-like openings in the vegetation, some large enough for a person to easily pass through. They seemed to form a network connecting different parts of the area. In one overgrown lot, I found what looked like a crude shelter made of branches and leaves. My unease grew as I realized how easy it would be for someone, or something, to move around undetected, especially at night. The vacant houses, lack of lighting, and abundant plant cover created the perfect conditions for concealment. That evening, I was too nervous to stay in the house alone. I drove into town and hung out at a bar until closing time, talking with some locals. When I casually asked if they'd ever seen anything strange in the area, they exchanged knowing looks. One older man leaned in and whispered, "We don't talk about what lives in the woods around here." I hardly slept at all that night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me bolt upright in bed. Around dawn, I dozed off briefly. I jolted awake to the sound of heavy breathing right outside my window. Heart pounding, I slowly turned my head to look. A massive, dark shape blocked most of the window. I could make out the vague outline of a huge, ape-like head. As my eyes adjusted, I found myself staring into deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. They were fixed right on me. I was paralyzed with terror. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a burst of movement, the creature vanished from view. I heard rapid, heavy footsteps retreating into the woods. Shaking, I scrambled out of bed and searched the area around the house. Large, bare footprints led from my window into the thick underbrush. As the sun rose, they seemed to evaporate before my eyes, leaving me to question if I had imagined the whole thing. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound. That evening, my girlfriend called to say her flight was delayed and she wouldn't arrive until the next day. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what had happened. I was scared she'd think I was losing my mind. As night fell, the house felt more oppressive than ever. Shadows danced on the walls and every creak had me on edge. Around midnight, I heard it. Heavy footsteps approaching the house again. My blood ran cold as they stopped right outside. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I've ever heard. It was somewhere between a growl and speech, carrying a clear sense of intelligence behind it. As it echoed through the night, other similar calls answered from the surrounding woods. Primal terror gripped me. I was certain that if I looked outside, I'd see multiple giant ape-like creatures converging on the house. Part of me wanted to run, to get in my car and drive far away, but I was too afraid to move, worried any sound might provoke them to break in. I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing, listening to the creatures move around outside. Eventually, the sounds faded as they retreated back into the woods. As the sky began to lighten, birds started their morning songs as if nothing had happened. When my girlfriend arrived later that morning, she found me wild-eyed and sleep-deprived. I tried to explain what had happened, but it all sounded crazy in the light of day. She was worried about me and insisted we leave immediately. I didn't argue. As we drove away, I caught glimpses of dark shapes moving in the trees lining the road. By the time we hit the highway, I had almost convinced myself it was all in my head, some combination of stress and an overactive imagination. But I can't shake the memory of those eyes staring at me through the window, the intelligence I saw there, the sense of something ancient and powerful. It haunts me. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters, trying to make sense of what happened. I haven't been back to ocean shores since then. Sometimes I consider returning, hoping to find proof of what I experienced. But the thought of coming face to face with those creatures again terrifies me. For now, I'm left with more questions than answers, and a lingering fear of what might be lurking just beyond the edge of civilization. Story 16. We'd been walking along the beach for about an hour, stopping here and there to examine interesting pieces of driftwood or take some photos. I was focused on framing up a shot of a particularly gnarly piece when my wife grabbed my arm. "Look at that," she said, pointing to the sand a few yards away. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the typical patterns left by the waves. But then I noticed what she was looking at, a series of large, deep impressions in the sand. My heart started racing as I realized what I was seeing. They were footprints, massive footprints. I walked over for a closer look, my wife trailing behind me. There were 5 distinct prints, each one easily 15-16 inches long and incredibly wide. The stride length between them was enormous, far beyond what any human could make. A chill ran down my spine as I crouched down to examine them more closely. The prints were deeply pressed into the damp sand, with clear toe impressions visible. Whatever made these tracks was extremely heavy and bipedal. My mind was reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. "Should we take a picture?" my wife asked nervously. I hesitated. Part of me desperately wanted photographic evidence of this incredible discovery. But another part of me was suddenly gripped with an irrational fear. What if whatever made these prints was still nearby? What if taking a photo would somehow alert it to our presence? "Let's just look for now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can always come back with a camera later if we want to." My wife nodded, clearly relieved. We spent several more minutes examining the tracks in stunned silence. I tried to commit every detail to memory: the size, the shape, the depth. I knew this was something I'd never forget as long as I lived. As amazing as the footprints were, an uneasy feeling was starting to grow in the pit of my stomach. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I had the distinct sensation of being watched. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to sound casual. My wife quickly agreed. We started walking briskly back the way we had come. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous figure emerge from the dunes. But the beach remained empty, save for a few distant gulls. We had gone maybe a quarter mile when my wife suddenly stopped in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened intently, but heard only the sound of the waves. "Hear what?" "I'm not sure," she said, her eyes wide. "It sounded like, I don't know, like a weird howl or something, coming from over there." She pointed towards a heavily forested area further inland. I strained my ears, but still couldn't make out anything unusual. "I don't hear..." And then I did hear it, a long, low vocalization that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite a howl or a roar or a scream. It was something altogether different and deeply unsettling. The sound seemed to reverberate in my chest. My wife clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" she hissed. "I don't know," I said, my mouth dry. "But I think we should get out of here. Now." We practically ran the rest of the way back to our car. I kept expecting to hear that bone-chilling sound again, but there was nothing but the pounding of our feet on the sand and our ragged breathing. It wasn't until we were safely in the car with the doors locked that I allowed myself to relax slightly. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. "What do you think it was?" my wife asked as we pulled away from the beach. I shook my head. "I honestly have no idea. Those prints, though, they were way too big to be human. And that sound, I've never heard anything like it." "Should we report it to someone?" she wondered. I thought about it for a moment. Who would we even tell? The police? Park rangers? They'd probably think we were crazy. She nodded slowly. "You're probably right. I'm not sure I want to tell anyone about this. They'd never believe us without proof anyway." So we made a mutual decision to keep the experience to ourselves. But in the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen and heard that day. I scoured the internet for similar reports, pored over books about cryptozoology, and even considered going back to look for more evidence. But something always held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the belief that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Whatever the reason, we never returned to that stretch of beach. It's been years now, but I still think about that day constantly. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced I can hear that eerie vocalization echoing in the distance. In my dreams, I see those massive footprints stretching endlessly down the beach. I don't know what we encountered that day in Ocean Shores, but I do know that it fundamentally changed how I view the world. There are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. And sometimes it's better not to look too closely at the shadows. I often wonder if anyone else has had similar experiences in that area. Part of me hopes they haven't. I wouldn't wish those moments of paralyzing fear on anyone. But another part of me selfishly hopes that someday someone will come forward with undeniable proof of whatever it was we encountered. Until then, all I have are my memories and the lingering question that haunts me: what if we had taken that photo? The experience has left me with a mix of emotions that I still struggle to process. There's the excitement and wonder of potentially encountering something truly extraordinary. But there's also a deep-seated fear that I can't quite shake. It's not just the fear of the unknown, but the realization that our understanding of the world around us might be far more limited than we'd like to believe. I find myself hyper-aware whenever I'm in nature now, always on the lookout for signs of something unusual. Every unexplained sound in the woods makes me wonder. Every large track in the mud gives me pause. It's like the encounter opened my eyes to a whole other layer of reality that I was previously blind to. My wife and I have talked about the incident countless times over the years, rehashing every detail. We've debated whether we should have taken photos, whether we should have told someone, whether we should go back. But in the end, we always come to the same conclusion. Some things are better left as personal experiences. There are nights when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that day in my mind. I can still feel the texture of the sand beneath my feet, still see those massive prints with perfect clarity. The sound of that vocalization is forever etched in my memory, a sound that defies description, but that I know I'd recognize instantly if I ever heard it again. Sometimes I wonder if we were meant to have that experience, if perhaps we stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to see, some secret of nature that's meant to remain hidden. Other times, I think it was just random chance, being in the right or wrong place at the right time. I've become somewhat obsessed with researching similar encounters. I've read countless books and articles, joined online forums, even attended a few conferences dedicated to cryptozoology. I'm always searching for that one piece of evidence that will confirm what we experienced, that will prove we're not crazy. But so far, nothing has come close to explaining what we saw and heard that day. The footprints we found were larger and more defined than any I've seen in photos or cast molds. The sound we heard doesn't match any known animal vocalizations. I've considered reaching out to researchers or investigators who specialize in this kind of thing. But something always holds me back. Maybe it's the fear of being ridiculed or not believed. Or maybe it's the realization that no matter what anyone says, they can't change what we experienced. So for now, I keep this incredible, terrifying experience to myself. I carry it with me every day, a secret knowledge that both thrills and haunts me. It's changed how I see the world, how I interact with nature, how I think about the possibilities of what might exist out there. I often find myself staring out at the forests or the ocean, wondering what secrets they hold. What other incredible creatures might be out there, just beyond our perception? It's both an exhilarating and terrifying thought. If I could go back to that day, would I do anything differently? Would I take that photo, concrete evidence of what we saw? I honestly don't know. Part of me wishes I had proof to share with the world. But another part of me is glad that the experience remains personal, something just for my wife and me. One thing's for certain. I'll never look at a beach the same way again. Every time I see a stretch of sand, I can't help but scan it for those telltale prints. And every time I hear an unusual sound in nature, my heart skips a beat. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand or come to terms with what happened that day in ocean shores, but I do know that it's an experience that will stay with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder that the world is far more mysterious and incredible than we often give it credit for. Story 17. It was around 10 p.m., and my partner Jake and I were just finishing up our shift. We were about to head back to the station when we got a call from dispatch about a distressed resident who had encountered some kind of unidentified creature in the woods behind his property. Normally, we'd brush off calls like this as pranks or the overactive imagination of someone who'd had a few too many drinks. But there was something in the dispatcher's voice that made us take it seriously. We arrived at the address about 15 minutes later. It was a modest house on the outskirts of town, bordering a dense forest. As we pulled up, I could see a middle-aged man pacing nervously on his front porch. He looked pale and shaken. Jake and I approached slowly, not wanting to startle him further. "Evening, sir," I said calmly. "I'm Officer Miller, and this is my partner, Officer Thompson. We received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell us what happened?" The man, who introduced himself as Tom, took a deep breath before launching into his story. He said he had been out for an evening walk in the woods behind his property, something he did regularly to clear his head after work. But tonight had been different. About a half-mile in, he heard what sounded like heavy footsteps and branches snapping. At first he thought it might be a bear or a deer, but then he caught a glimpse of something through the trees that made his blood run cold. Tom described seeing a massive, hair-covered creature walking on two legs. He estimated it was at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. The creature's face was ape-like, but with strikingly human eyes. Tom said he froze in terror as the being stared directly at him for several long seconds before quickly disappearing into the thick underbrush. As Tom recounted his experience, I could see the fear and confusion in his eyes. His hands were shaking slightly, and his voice quavered at times. This wasn't the typical behavior of someone making up a tall tale or playing a prank. Tom genuinely believed he had seen something extraordinary and terrifying. Jake and I exchanged a look. In our years on the force, we'd encountered more unexplained phenomena than we cared to admit. We knew better than to automatically dismiss claims of the paranormal or cryptozoological. "It's all right, Tom," I said reassuringly. "We believe you. Why don't we go inside and you can tell us more about what you saw? We'd like to take an official statement." Tom seemed relieved by our accepting response. He invited us in, and we spent the next 2 hours carefully documenting every detail of his encounter. We asked him to draw a sketch of the creature and mark on a map exactly where the sighting occurred. Throughout the interview, we maintained a professional and compassionate demeanor. It was clear Tom needed to feel heard and validated. As we wrapped up, I placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "I know this must have been a frightening experience for you," I said, "but I want you to know that you're not alone. We've had other reports of strange sightings in these woods over the years. We take them all seriously." Jake chimed in. "That's right. We've seen some pretty bizarre things ourselves on night patrols out here. There's a lot we still don't understand about what's out there." Tom visibly relaxed, clearly comforted by our words. "Thank you both," he said. "I was worried you'd think I was crazy or lying. I've never experienced anything like this before. I don't know what to make of it." "You're not crazy, Tom," I assured him. "We appreciate you coming forward with this information. We'll increase patrols in the area and look into any similar reports. In the meantime, try to stay out of those woods after dark, all right?" As Jake and I left Tom's house, we both felt a sense of unease. We'd handled the situation professionally, but we couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Tom's story than just an overactive imagination or a case of mistaken identity. Back in the patrol car, Jake turned to me. "What do you think, Miller? You think Tom really saw something out there?" I sighed heavily. "I don't know, Thompson. But I've been on this force long enough to know that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Remember that call we got last summer about the lights in the sky? Or the time we found those weird tracks by the lake?" Jake nodded solemnly. "Yeah, I remember. It's like there's a whole other world out there that most people never see." "Exactly," I replied. "And it's our job to keep an open mind and protect the public, no matter how strange things get." We drove in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. As we neared the station, Jake spoke up again. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about a creature in these woods. called it the Forest Guardian, said it had been protecting this land long before settlers arrived. I raised an eyebrow. You think that's what Tom saw? Jake shrugged. Who knows? But I'll tell you one thing. I'm going to be keeping my eyes peeled on our next night patrol. As we pulled into the station parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter with Tom was just the beginning of something bigger. In all my years on the force, I'd learned that sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and in a town like ours, nestled between ancient forests and mist-shrouded mountains, anything was possible. I spent that night tossing and turning, unable to get Tom's description of the creature out of my mind. The next morning, I arrived at the station early to do some research. I pulled up old case files, looking for any similar reports in the area. To my surprise, I found several incidents dating back decades, all describing a large bipedal creature in the woods. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I increased our patrols in the area around Tom's property. We didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but there was a palpable tension in the air. It felt like we were being watched, like something was out there just beyond our sight. One night, about a month after Tom's initial report, we got another call. This time, it was from a group of hikers who had been camping in the woods. They described hearing strange vocalizations and finding massive human-like footprints near their campsite. When we arrived on the scene, we found the hikers huddled together, visibly shaken. The footprints were unlike anything I'd ever seen, over 18 inches long and deeply impressed into the hard forest floor. As we took statements and photographed the evidence, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and fear. Were we on the verge of proving the existence of something that had been dismissed as myth and legend for centuries? But just as quickly as the incidents had started, they seemed to stop. The woods fell silent again, and life in our small town returned to normal. Tom never reported seeing the creature again, though he admitted to feeling uneasy whenever he ventured into the forest. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of what happened during those strange few weeks. Was it mass hysteria? A clever hoax? Or was there really something out there? Something that defied our understanding of the natural world? One thing I know for certain. My experiences that summer changed me. I approach my job now with a more open mind, always ready to listen and investigate, no matter how outlandish a claim might seem. Because in this line of work, you never know when you might stumble upon a truth that's stranger than fiction. As I sit here writing this, I can't help but glance out my window at the dark line of trees in the distance. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can see something moving out there in the shadows, something big, something watching, and I wonder, will it ever reveal itself again, or will it remain a mystery, forever lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding? Story 18. As I crept along at about 30 miles/hour, my headlights barely cutting through the swirling snow, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the side of the road, was a massive, dark figure. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I got closer, I realized it was far too big and oddly shaped to be any normal animal. The creature was easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in huge hands. But what struck me most was its face, unmistakably ape-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in my headlights. I only caught a glimpse for a few seconds as I drove by, but in that moment our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of primal fear course through me. I sped up, my heart pounding. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature turn and step onto the road behind me. Its gait was smooth and purposeful, not at all like a person in a costume. I pressed down harder on the gas, fishtailing slightly on the snowy road. For the next few miles I was in a state of panic, constantly checking my mirrors. I kept expecting to see the creature appear behind me, but there was nothing but swirling snow. Eventually, I made it to a small town and pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to tell someone, but who would believe me? I knew how crazy it would sound. So I just ordered some coffee, waited for my nerves to settle, and eventually continued on home. In the days and weeks that followed, I obsessively researched Bigfoot sightings in that area. I found a few similar reports from that same stretch of highway, which both unnerved and oddly comforted me. At least I wasn't alone in what I'd seen. But I still couldn't shake the memory of those eyes meeting mine. There was an unmistakable intelligence there, a sentience that haunts me to this day. I find myself constantly wondering, what if it had decided to chase me? What was it doing out there in that storm? How many of these creatures could be out there, just beyond the edges of our awareness? I've become fascinated with the topic of Bigfoot and other cryptids since that night. I've even started a podcast where I document cases and interview witnesses. I'm hoping that by creating a space for people to share their experiences, we might eventually get closer to understanding what's really out there. That's why I'm sharing my story now. I know it sounds unbelievable, but I swear every word is true. If anyone else has had a similar experience, especially in that area, please reach out. Maybe together we can start to piece together this mystery. I still drive that highway sometimes, always with a mixture of fear and curiosity. I've never seen the creature again, but I can't help scanning the tree line, wondering if it's out there watching. The encounter only lasted a few seconds, but it changed my life forever. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying those moments in my mind. The way the snow swirled in my headlights, the looming dark shape emerging from the shadows, those piercing eyes. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just my imagination or some trick of the light. But deep down, I know what I saw. I've spoken to wildlife experts, trying to find some explanation. They've suggested it could have been a bear, or even a moose, but none of their explanations fit. The creature I saw walked on two legs with an eerily human-like gait. Its proportions were all wrong for any known animal. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stopped, tried to get a photo or some other evidence, but in that moment, all I could think about was getting away. The primal fear I felt was overwhelming. It was like my entire body was screaming at me to flee. I've gone back to that spot a few times since then, in daylight hours. I've searched for footprints or hair samples, anything that might corroborate what I saw. But I've never found any physical evidence. It's like the creature vanished into thin air after our encounter. The experience has made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. If something like that can exist without definitive proof, what else might be out there? It's opened my eyes to the possibility that there's so much we don't understand about our planet and its inhabitants. I know there are skeptics out there who will say I'm crazy or lying. I get it. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw, and I know I'm not alone. There are countless reports of similar sightings all over the world. That's why I started the podcast. I wanted to create a platform where people could share their experiences without fear of ridicule. Every week, I talk to witnesses, researchers, and experts in various fields. We dig into the evidence, analyze patterns, and try to make sense of these encounters. One thing that struck me is how similar many of the accounts are. People from all walks of life, in different parts of the world, describe seeing creatures with remarkably consistent features. It's hard to believe it's all just a collective delusion or misidentification. I've also noticed that many witnesses, like myself, report a profound emotional impact from their encounters. It's not just about seeing something unusual. There's often a deep, visceral reaction that stays with people for years. Many describe it as a life-changing event. As I've delved deeper into this world, I've encountered all sorts of theories about what these creatures might be. Some believe they're an undiscovered primate species. Others think they're interdimensional beings or even aliens. I try to keep an open mind, but honestly, I have no idea what to believe. What I do know is that my encounter that snowy night was real. The image of that creature is seared into my memory. I can still feel the fear that gripped me, can still see those eyes staring back at me through the swirling snow. I often wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently. What if my car had broken down? What if the creature had been aggressive? The possibilities still send chills down my spine. That's why I'm reaching out now, sharing my story. I'm hoping that maybe someone else out there has had a similar experience on that stretch of highway. Maybe together we can start to piece together this puzzle. If you've seen something you can't explain, don't be afraid to speak up. You're not alone. There are more of us out there than you might think, people whose lives have been changed by encounters with the unknown. As for me, I'll keep searching for answers. Every time I drive that highway, every time I interview a new witness on my podcast, I'm hoping to get one step closer to understanding what's really out there. Because once you've seen something like that, you can never go back to believing the world is exactly as you thought it was. The truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of our forests, in the depths of our oceans, in the remote corners of our world. And I, for one, am determined to find it. Story 19. I pulled over onto the shoulder, thinking I'd let Buddy out to do his business and stretch my own legs. As soon as I opened the door, something felt off. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Buddy jumped down from the cab and I followed, my boots crunching on the gravel. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Buddy froze, his ears perked up, and then he started whining. I've never seen him act like that before. I scanned the tree line, trying to figure out what was making that sound. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, movement caught my eye. Something big was coming out of the woods. My heart nearly stopped when I realized what I was looking at. It was, well, there's no other way to say it. It was a Sasquatch. A real, honest-to-God Bigfoot. And not just one, there were 3 of them. The first one to emerge was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me. Had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, matted in places. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees. And its face, God, its face. It was like a cross between a gorilla and a man, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. But what really got me was what it was carrying. Slung over its shoulder was a huge black boar. Had to be at least 200 pounds, but this creature was holding it like it weighed nothing at all. Behind the big one came 2 smaller figures. One was clearly female, about 7 feet tall, with lighter-colored hair. And in her arms, I still can't believe it, she was carrying an infant, a baby Sasquatch, clinging to its mother's chest. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, or a hallucination from too many hours on the road. But Buddy's trembling body pressed against my leg told me this was no dream. The big male, I assume it was the father, stopped about 50 feet from where I stood. It dropped the boar on the ground with a heavy thud. Then it turned those piercing eyes on me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was certain I was about to die. This thing could have torn me apart without breaking a sweat. But it didn't attack. Instead, it opened its mouth and let out a roar that shook me to my core. It wasn't just loud, it was primal, ancient, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The female and the infant retreated a bit, moving back towards the tree line, but the male stood its ground, puffing out its chest and beating it with massive fists. It was a warning, clear as day. This was its territory, and I was an intruder. I managed to find my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Easy, big fella," I said, holding up my hands. "I don't mean any harm, just passing through." To my utter amazement, the creature seemed to pause, its head tilted slightly, as if it was listening, understanding. I can't be sure, but in that moment, I felt like there was a connection, like it knew I wasn't a threat. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, slowly, deliberately, the male Sasquatch reached down and picked up the boar. It turned, looking back at me one last time, then loped off into the woods. The female and infant followed, disappearing into the shadows. As soon as they were gone, it was like a spell had been broken. Suddenly, I could hear again. Birds started chirping, insects buzzing. The oppressive silence was lifted. I scooped up Buddy and practically ran back to the truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I pulled back onto the highway and didn't stop driving until I reached Dallas. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the experience. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. I've heard all the stories about Bigfoot, seen the blurry photos and shaky videos, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality. What I saw that morning wasn't just some animal. These creatures were intelligent. The way they moved, the way they communicated with each other, it was almost human. The male's display wasn't just aggression, it was a calculated move to protect its family. And the way it seemed to understand that I wasn't a threat. It chills me to think about it. I've debated for months whether to share this story. I know how it sounds. If someone had told me this a year ago, I'd have thought they were crazy or lying. But I know what I saw. Those creatures are out there, living their lives just beyond the edge of our world. I still drive that route sometimes, and every time I pass that spot, I slow down a little. Part of me hopes to see them again, to prove to myself that it wasn't just some vivid dream. But mostly, I hope they're safe, wherever they are. After what I saw, I can't help but feel a strange sort of kinship with them. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that morning in Texas, and it's changed the way I see the world forever. Story 20. It was late August 2005, and we'd signed up for an overnight tournament. Dad and I had been fishing these waters for years, but we'd never ventured out this late before. As the sun started to set, we made our way to a secluded cove we knew was great for largemouth bass. The high bluffs surrounding the cove cast long shadows across the water, making it feel even darker and more isolated than usual. We anchored the boat and started casting our lines, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the whir of our reels. The night was unusually still, almost unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. I remember feeling uneasy, but I chalked it up to nerves about the tournament. It must have been around 10 p.m. when we heard the first splash. At first, we thought it was just a big fish jumping, but then we heard it again, and again. These weren't normal splashes. They were massive, like something huge was thrashing in the water. Dad and I exchanged glances, both of us clearly unnerved. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Dad just shook his head, his eyes scanning the shoreline. That's when the rocks started hitting the water. Not little pebbles, mind you, but sizable rocks, the kind you'd need 2 hands to throw. They were landing with incredible force, sending up sprays of water that we could feel even from 30 feet away. One landed so close to our boat that it rocked us, nearly knocking me off my seat. Jesus Christ, Dad exclaimed, grabbing the sides of the boat to steady himself. "We need to get out of here." But before we could start the engine, we heard it. A low, guttural grunt that seemed to echo off the bluffs. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a wildcat, nothing I could identify. It was deep and powerful, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Dad reached for the flashlight, his hand shaking as he flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the shoreline. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. Something big. But it was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. More rocks splashed into the water around us, some hitting with such precision it seemed impossible they were being thrown randomly. Whatever was out there, it had aim and intelligence. "Start the engine," Dad said, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" I fumbled with the key, my hands slick with sweat. The engine sputtered to life, sounding impossibly loud in the quiet night. As we started to pull away from the shore, I heard movement in the underbrush, heavy footsteps and the snap of branches. Then, out of nowhere, a massive log came hurtling through the air, missing our boat by inches. It hit the water with a crash, sending up a wave that nearly capsized us. Dad gunned the engine, and we shot out of the cove like a rocket. As we sped away, I looked back. In the dim light of the moon, I swear I saw two large, dark figures standing at the edge of the water. They were massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. But what struck me most were their eyes. They seemed to glow in the darkness, watching us as we fled. We didn't stop until we reached the main channel of the river, where a few other tournament boats were scattered about. Dad and I sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. "You saw them too, right?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad nodded slowly. "I saw something," he said, "but I don't know what." We debated whether to tell anyone about what we'd seen, but who would believe us? Two creatures, impossibly strong and smart, terrorizing fishermen in the middle of the night. It sounded crazy even to us, and we'd lived through it. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. We finished the tournament. Needless to say, we didn't catch many fish that night, but we never went back to that cove again. In fact, we rarely fished at night after that. It's been years now, but I still think about that night often. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and watched countless documentaries, always looking for something that matches what we experienced. But nothing ever comes close to the terror of that night on the Tennessee River. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can still hear those grunts echoing in my head. And I wonder, are they still out there, watching, waiting in the shadows? And what would have happened if we hadn't gotten away? I don't have answers to these questions, and part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. Things that are smarter, stronger, and more terrifying than we can imagine. And if you're ever fishing on the Tennessee River at night and you hear a splash that's just a little too big to be a fish, well, my advice would be to get the hell out of there as fast as you can. Because trust me, you don't want to meet what's lurking in those shadows. Some things are better left undiscovered, some mysteries better left unsolved. And whatever was in that cove that night, it definitely falls into that category. I've never told this story publicly before. Part of me is still afraid that people will think I'm crazy or making it up. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And if sharing this can help someone else avoid a similar encounter, then it's worth the risk of ridicule. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Were they some unknown species of primate? Some kind of forest spirit? Or something else entirely? I don't know. But I do know that they were real, they were intelligent, and they were absolutely terrifying. So if you're ever out on the water at night and you get that feeling that something's not quite right, trust your instincts. Because sometimes the monsters in the shadows are all too real. And they're watching, waiting for their chance to remind us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. As for me, I still fish, but never at night, and never in that cove. Some places, once you've seen what's hiding there, you can never go back. And some memories, no matter how hard you try, you can never shake. That night on the Tennessee River changed me forever. It opened my eyes to a world beyond what we think we know, a world where creatures of legend might just be real. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can still hear those grunts carried on the breeze, a reminder that out there, in the wild places of the world, there are still mysteries waiting to be discovered, and some of them have teeth. Story 21. I'll never forget that day on the Florida highway. It was 1997, and I was driving down to visit my sister in Tampa. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on my little Honda Civic as I cruised along the interstate. Pine trees lined both sides of the road, creating a green blur in my peripheral vision. I had the radio on low, some forgettable pop song playing as background noise. My mind was wandering, thinking about work and bills and all the usual mundane stuff. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A quick flash of movement between the trees, gone almost as soon as I registered it. But then I saw it again, this time clearly. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Some kind of creature, moving with incredible speed through the pine forest. My brain couldn't quite process what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but definitely not human. The way it moved was all wrong, too fast, too fluid. I found myself slowing down instinctively, my foot easing off the gas pedal as I strained to get a better look. The thing was keeping pace with my car, darting between trees with unnatural agility. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. As I watched, transfixed, the creature bounded across a small clearing. For just a split second, I got a clear view of it in the sunlight. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown fur. Long arms swung as it ran on two legs. The face, I couldn't make out details, but it wasn't a human face, more like a cross between an ape and something else I couldn't identify. My heart was pounding now. I blinked hard, wondering if I was hallucinating. But when I opened my eyes again, the thing was still there, still running alongside the highway. I must have been going about 60 mph at that point, but this creature was keeping up effortlessly. It would disappear behind a cluster of trees, then reappear seconds later even further ahead. The raw power and speed was astonishing. Part of me wanted to pull over and try to get a better look, but a stronger instinct told me to keep driving. Whatever this thing was, it didn't seem natural. I had a primal urge to put as much distance between myself and it as possible. So I pressed down on the gas, accelerating to 70, then 80 mph. My palms were sweating as I gripped the wheel, constantly glancing to my right to see if the creature was still there. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, I could still catch glimpses of it, bounding through the trees. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I kept driving at high speed for several more miles, my heart racing. Only when I was absolutely certain the thing was no longer following did I allow myself to slow down to a more reasonable speed. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. It was clearly some kind of animal, but unlike any I'd ever seen or heard of. The speed and agility were beyond anything I thought possible for a creature that size. As the initial shock wore off, I found myself running through possible explanations. Could it have been some kind of escaped exotic pet? A new species that hadn't been documented yet? Or something else entirely? I'd never given much thought to cryptids or unexplained phenomena before. But in that moment, I understood how people could become obsessed with searching for creatures like Bigfoot. If what I saw was real, and I was certain it was, then there were things out there beyond our current understanding. The rest of my drive to Tampa passed in a daze. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to remember every detail. By the time I reached my sister's house, I was both exhausted and wired. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said when I arrived. I laughed nervously. Not a ghost, but something. I ended up telling her about the encounter. To her credit, she didn't immediately dismiss me as crazy. But I could tell she was skeptical. Hell, I was skeptical of myself. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it either. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature running through the trees. I kept wondering where it had come from and where it had gone. Was it still out there in the Florida wilderness? Were there more like it? The next day, I scoured local news sites, half expecting to see headlines about a strange creature sighted on the highway. But there was nothing. No reports, no sightings, no explanations. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself diving deep into research about unexplained phenomena and cryptid sightings. I read every Bigfoot encounter story I could find, comparing details to what I'd seen. Some matched up eerily well, while others seemed far-fetched even compared to my own experience. I never told many people about what I saw that day. It's the kind of story that makes people look at you differently. But I know what I saw. That creature was real, whatever it was. Now, years later, I still think about that day often. Every time I drive down a tree-lined highway, I find myself scanning the forest, half hoping and half fearing I'll catch another glimpse of that mysterious creature. I've never seen anything like it again, but the memory of that encounter has stayed with me, crystal clear. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world we don't yet understand, things that defy explanation. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen that same creature on that stretch of Florida highway. If they have, I hope they come forward with their story, because the more I've thought about it over the years, the more convinced I've become. What I saw that day wasn't just some unknown animal, it was something truly extraordinary. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what exactly I encountered that day, but I do know this. It changed the way I see the world. It made me question what I thought I knew about nature and the creatures we share this planet with. And on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I sometimes imagine I hear the sound of swift, powerful footsteps racing through the forest. A reminder that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. Story 22. It was January 2017, and my friends and I were on our annual winter camping trip in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. We'd been doing this trip for years. It was a tradition, a way to start the new year with adventure. There were 5 of us: me, Jake, Melissa, Chris, and Tom. We'd rented an RV and driven out to a remote spot deep in the pines, miles from the nearest town or paved road. The first day was great. We hiked, cooked over the fire, shared some beers. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. The wind howled through the skeletal winter trees. We huddled around the campfire, telling stories and enjoying each other's company. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. Jake, Chris, and Tom slept in tents, while Melissa and I took the RV. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by a sound I'll never forget. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. At first, I thought I was dreaming. But then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart started racing. I shook Melissa awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, eyes wide with fear. We peered out the RV windows, but couldn't see anything in the pitch darkness. Suddenly, we heard a thunderous boom that shook the whole vehicle. Then another, and another. It was like something massive was slamming against the trees around us. The noises were getting closer. I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling hands. When I shone it out the window, what I saw made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of our campsite, was a creature I can only describe as a Sasquatch. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in shaggy dark fur, but its eyes, God, its eyes. They were jet black and seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. Soulless, predatory. As my light hit it, the creature let out a bone-chilling roar and charged toward our fire pit. With terrifying strength, it began hurling burning logs and embers at the RV. The metal sizzled as hot coals struck it. Melissa screamed. I could hear Jake yelling from his tent, asking what was going on. "Get in the RV," I shouted. "Now!" The next few minutes were chaos. Jake, Chris, and Tom scrambled out of their tents and sprinted for the RV door. As Tom, the last one, clambered inside, the creature lunged and just missed grabbing his leg. We slammed the door shut. The 5 of us huddled in the RV, paralyzed with fear, as the beast raged outside. It circled the vehicle, occasionally slamming against the sides with enough force to rock us. The windows rattled in their frames. I was sure they would shatter at any moment. The smell hit us next, this horrible putrid stench of rotting meat that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. It was so strong it seemed to seep through the walls. Melissa threw up. We could hear the creature's heavy breathing and grunts as it prowled around us. Occasionally it would let out one of those terrifying roars that vibrated in my chest. I've never felt so helpless, so certain I was going to die. This torment went on for hours. None of us dared to move or speak above a whisper. We had no cell service to call for help. All we could do was wait and pray the RV would hold. As the first pale light of dawn broke through the trees, the noises and impacts finally began to subside. We waited in tense silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Jake summoned the courage to peek out a window. I think it's gone," he said hoarsely. Slowly, cautiously, we emerged from the RV. The campsite was destroyed, tents were shredded, gear was scattered everywhere. Deep claw marks scored the trees around us. The fire pit was a heap of scattered ash and charred wood. But the creature was nowhere to be seen. It had vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving only destruction in its wake. We didn't say much as we hurriedly packed up what remained of our belongings. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd experienced. I've spent countless hours since then researching, trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've read about other Bigfoot encounters, looked into local legends, but nothing quite matches the sheer terror of what we went through. I still camp and hike, but never again in the Pine Barrens. The others feel the same. That place holds only fear for us now. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that inhuman roar echoing in my mind. I don't know if it was truly a Sasquatch or some other unknown creature. All I know is that it was real, it was terrifying, and it forever changed how I view the natural world. There are things out there in the dark woods that defy explanation, things that maybe we're not meant to understand. I'm sharing this story now in hopes that others might believe me, might take precautions if they venture into those remote areas. But mostly, I think I needed to finally let it out, to face that fear by putting it into words. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would if I hadn't lived through it. But I swear on everything I hold dear, this is the truth. This happened. And I'll carry the memory of that night with me for the rest of my life. Story 23. I was just a 10-year-old kid visiting my uncle's place in rural North Carolina back in 2017. Looking back now, I still can't fully explain what happened that day, but I know it changed me forever. It was early June, and school had just let out for the summer. My parents had sent me to stay with my uncle for a couple weeks, probably to get a break from my endless energy. Uncle Mike lived on this huge property out in the boonies, surrounded by dense forest. He had all these cool toys, ATVs, dirt bikes, and my favorite, a souped-up go-kart that could really fly. That fateful morning started like any other. I wolfed down some cereal, threw on a t-shirt and shorts, and begged Uncle Mike to let me take the go-kart out. He was busy fixing up his truck, so he just waved me off with a distracted, "Be careful and stay close to the house." I hopped in that go-kart with a whoop of excitement. The engine roared to life, and I took off down the wide dirt path that led into the woods. The cool morning air whipped through my hair as I sped along, swerving around puddles left by the previous night's rain. I'd been out there maybe 15 minutes when something caught my eye, a blur of dark brown movement in the tree line to my right. I hit the brakes, kicking up a cloud of dust as I skidded to a stop. Peering into the thick undergrowth, I waited, breath held. There it was again, definitely something big, moving through the trees. Without thinking, I gunned the engine and veered off the path, following whatever it was. Looking back, I can't believe how stupid that decision was. But I was a curious kid, fearless in that naive way children often are. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, branches scraping against the sides of the go-kart. I had to slow down to weave between trunks and over gnarled roots. That's when I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The woods seemed to press in around me, the cheerful bird song from earlier replaced by an eerie silence. I was about to turn back when I saw it clearly for the first time, and my blood ran cold. Standing maybe 30 feet away was a massive, hair-covered creature. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung below its knees. The thing's head was dome-shaped, set directly on broad, sloping shoulders with no visible neck. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, filled with what looked like curiosity. Then it let out a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. That snapped me out of my shocked daze, and panic set in. I yanked the steering wheel hard, the go-kart's tires spinning in the soft forest loam before finding purchase. As I tore away in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my ears, I heard heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind me. A quick glance over my shoulder nearly made me lose control of the cart. There were 2 of them now, running after me with long, loping strides. I'd always been a fast kid, one of the best runners in my class. But these creatures kept pace with the go-kart effortlessly, even as I pushed it to its limits. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I careened through the woods, desperately trying to find my way back to the main path. The creatures stayed right on my tail, letting out occasional grunts and whoops that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't understand why they didn't just reach out and grab me. Their arms were certainly long enough. It was almost like they were herding me, steering me in a certain direction. Just when I thought my heart might explode from fear and exertion, I burst out of the tree line onto the main dirt road. I didn't slow down, pushing the go-kart to its absolute limit as I raced back towards my uncle's house. Only when the buildings came into view did I dare to look behind me again. The creatures had stopped at the edge of the forest. They stood there watching me, their massive forms half hidden by the trees. As I skidded to a stop in front of my uncle's garage, my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand, I saw them melt back into the shadows of the woods. I stumbled into the house, babbling incoherently about monsters in the forest. My uncle, alarmed by my hysteria and the scratches covering my arms and face, tried to calm me down. When I finally managed to tell him what happened, I could see the disbelief in his eyes. He went out to check the woods himself, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove what I'd seen. For a long time after that, I was terrified of the forest. I had nightmares about those creatures chasing me, their long arms reaching out to snatch me up. But as the initial shock wore off, I started to think about the encounter differently. I realized that if they had wanted to hurt me, they easily could have. They were so much faster and stronger than me. The more I reflected on it, the more I became convinced that they hadn't meant me any harm. Maybe they were just as curious about me as I had been about them. Perhaps they were trying to guide me back to safety when I'd gotten too deep into their territory. I never told anyone else about what happened that day. Who would believe a kid's wild story about being chased by Bigfoot? But the experience changed me. I developed a deep respect for nature and its mysteries. I became fascinated with cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. Now, years later, I still can't explain exactly what I encountered in those North Carolina woods. Were they really Sasquatch, some unknown species of primate, or just a product of an overactive childhood imagination? I don't have the answers, but I know what I saw, what I felt. The memory of those creatures, their size, their speed, the intelligence in their eyes, is as vivid now as it was that day. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent or hear a twig snap in the distance. And for a moment, I'm that scared 10-year-old kid again, heart racing, wondering what might be watching me from just beyond the tree line. But now, that feeling is tinged with something else, a sense of awe and respect for the unknown wonders that might still exist in this world, hidden just out of sight. Story 24. I was just a kid back in '76, barely 13 when it happened. My family and I were out in the mountains above Jacksonville, Oregon, scouting for potential hunting spots. It was supposed to be an ordinary day trip, nothing special, but what I saw that day has haunted me for decades. We'd driven up in our old pickup truck, bouncing along dirt roads until we found a good place to park. Dad wanted to hike a bit, get a feel for the terrain. Mum stayed behind to set up a little picnic area. My younger sister was with her, playing with some toys she'd brought along. I was at that age where I wanted to prove myself, so I asked if I could go off exploring on my own for a while. Dad hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, telling me not to go too far and to be back in an hour. I promised I would, grabbed my backpack, and set off into the woods. It was a beautiful day, late summer. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. I remember feeling so grown up, trekking through the forest by myself. I was imagining all sorts of adventures. Maybe I'd spot a deer or find an old miner's cabin. Kid stuff, I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I came to a small clearing. There was a fallen log near the edge, and I decided to take a breather. I sat down, pulled out my canteen, and took a long drink of water. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but then I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, but not like any animal I'd ever heard before. They were heavy, purposeful. I froze, my heart starting to race. I remember thinking it might be a bear, but something deep inside told me this was different. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear branches snapping under the weight of whatever was approaching. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, about 25 yards away, this thing stepped out from between the trees. I say thing because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, and it was covered in thick, dark hair, not fur, but hair, like a person's, but all over its body. The way it moved, that's what really got me. It wasn't lumbering like a bear or prancing like a deer. It walked upright with this fluid, almost graceful motion, like a person, but not quite. Its arms were long, swinging gently at its sides as it walked. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was partially obscured by the hair and the shadows of the trees, but I could feel its presence, this overwhelming sense of intelligence, awareness. I don't know how to describe it. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. I just sat there on that log, watching as this creature strode across the edge of the clearing. It didn't seem to notice me at first, and I prayed it wouldn't. But then, about halfway across the clearing, it stopped. It turned its head slowly, and I swear it looked right at me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt its gaze. It was like time stood still. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in this silent standoff. Then, without warning, it just turned and walked back into the forest. No rush, no hurry, just a calm, deliberate retreat into the trees. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. When I finally managed to move, I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the branches whipping my face or the roots trying to trip me up. I just knew I had to get back to my family. I burst out of the woods near our picnic spot, gasping for air, covered in sweat and dirt. My mom took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She asked what had happened, if I was hurt. I opened my mouth to tell them, but I couldn't. I couldn't find the words to describe what I'd seen. And more than that, I was afraid. Afraid they wouldn't believe me, afraid they'd think I was making it up or had imagined it. So I lied. I told them I'd gotten spooked by a noise in the woods and ran back. Dad laughed it off, said it was probably just a deer. Mom fussed over me, cleaning the scratches on my face and arms. My sister thought it was hilarious that her big brother got scared in the woods, and I just sat there quiet, trying to make sense of it all. We finished our picnic and headed home. The whole ride back, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The size of the creature, the way it moved, that moment when it looked at me. I couldn't shake it. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision. I wouldn't tell anyone what I'd really seen. Who would believe me? A kid claiming he saw some giant, hairy man-creature in the woods? I'd be laughed at, or worse, people would think I was crazy. So I kept it to myself. For years, I didn't breathe a word of it to anyone. But it never left me. I'd have nightmares about it, wake up in a cold sweat thinking I could hear those heavy footsteps outside my window. Every time we went camping or hunting, I'd be on edge, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. As I got older, I started researching. I'd go to the library, poring over books about local legends and folklore. That's when I first heard the term Bigfoot. The descriptions matched what I'd seen, a large bipedal creature covered in hair, often spotted in the Pacific Northwest. But even then, I kept my experience to myself. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that I finally told someone. I was out having drinks with some buddies, and the conversation turned to weird experiences we'd had. After a few beers, I found myself telling them about that day in the woods. To my surprise, they didn't laugh. One of them even shared a similar story his uncle had told him. That opened the floodgates. I started seeking out others who'd had encounters, joining online forums, attending conferences. It was a relief to finally talk about it, to know I wasn't alone. But even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see that creature as clearly as if it were yesterday. I've never been able to explain what I saw that day. Was it really Bigfoot, some unknown species? A hallucination brought on by fear and an overactive imagination? I don't know. But I know what I saw, and it changed me forever. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I'll catch a whiff of that pine-scented air, and for a moment, I'm that scared 13-year-old kid again, watching in awe and terror as something impossible walks by. And I wonder, is it still out there? And if it is, does it remember me too? Story 25. I'll never forget that day in the woods when I was 7 years old. It was the summer of 1967, and my best friend Jackie and I were always looking for new adventures in the forest behind my house. We'd spend hours exploring, climbing trees, and imagining we were intrepid explorers discovering uncharted wilderness. But nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered that sweltering August afternoon. The day started like any other. Jackie came over after lunch and we headed straight for the woods, armed with our usual gear, a couple of peanut butter sandwiches, a canteen of water, and our trusty walking sticks. We had plans to venture further than ever before, determined to find the magic clearing we were convinced existed deep in the heart of the forest. As we hiked along our familiar trail, everything seemed normal at first. The cicadas were buzzing, birds were chirping, and shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the leafy canopy above. But about an hour into our trek, we came across something bizarre that stopped us in our tracks. There, in a small opening between the trees, was an enormous oak that looked like it had been yanked out of the ground and replanted upside down. Its sprawling root system reached toward the sky like gnarled fingers, while the branches were buried deep in the earth. Jackie and I just stood there, gaping at it, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. "How is that even possible?" I whispered, not wanting to break the eerie silence that had settled over the woods. Jackie shook her head, eyes wide. "I don't know, but it's creeping me out. Maybe we should head back." But curiosity got the better of us, and we cautiously approached the inverted tree for a closer look. That's when things started to get really weird. As we circled the trunk, small pebbles and acorns began raining down on us from above. At first I thought it was just squirrels or birds, but when I looked up, the branches were bare and still. There was nothing there that could be causing it. A shiver ran down my spine as I locked eyes with Jackie. I could tell she was as freaked out as I was. "Okay, this is getting scary," she said. "Let's go." We turned to leave, but found our path blocked by a tangle of branches that definitely hadn't been there before. It was like the forest itself was trying to keep us there. My heart began to race as panic set in. What was happening? That's when the smell hit us. A putrid, musky odor that made my eyes water and my stomach churn. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before, a mixture of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't place. The stench was so overpowering I actually gagged. "We need to get out of here now," Jackie choked out between coughs. We started pushing our way through the branches, no longer caring about scratches or torn clothes. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible, but as we stumbled through the underbrush, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind a massive oak about 30 feet away, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in long, matted, reddish-brown fur. Its face was strangely flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an eerie intelligence. For a moment our gazes locked, and I felt frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. But strangest of all, I didn't feel threatened. The creature's expression seemed almost curious, like it was just as fascinated by me as I was by it. A tug on my arm broke the spell as Jackie yanked me away. "Come on!" she yelled. "Run!" We tore through the woods at breakneck speed, branches whipping our faces and roots threatening to trip us at every step. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps pounding after us, but there was nothing but the sound of our own ragged breathing and pounding hearts. When we finally burst out of the tree line into my backyard, we collapsed on the grass, gasping for air. Jackie was in tears, and I wasn't far behind. We tried to explain what happened to my mum, but she just assumed we'd gotten spooked by shadows or an overactive imagination. "You girls and your wild stories," she said with a chuckle. "I think you've been watching too many monster movies." But Jackie and I knew what we saw was real. We made a pact that day to never speak of it again, too afraid that people would think we were crazy. As the years passed, I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of shared delusion or waking dream, but deep down, I know the truth. Something was in those woods that day, something that defied explanation. And sometimes, late at night when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can still smell that musky odor and feel those intelligent eyes watching me from the darkness. I've never gone back to that part of the forest. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I'll carry the memory of that encounter for the rest of my life, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, those things find us when we least expect it.